Hi everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty presents one of the most psychologically revealing portrayals of alcoholism in animated television. And by examining his constant drinking, his use of alcohol for emotional coping, his nihilistic worldview, and how drinking shapes his relationships and risk-taking behavior, we can understand alcoholism as a window into deeper questions about pain, avoidance, and living with unresolved trauma. This video examines Rick's alcohol use from an observational perspective, focusing on patterns shown in actual episodes. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Alcoholism as narrative constant. When Rick and Morty premiered in December 2013, the very first episode established something about Rick Sanchez that has remained consistent across every season since. Rick drinks alcohol constantly. This is not something that developed over time or that appeared gradually as the show evolved. From the pilot episode Pilot, Rick appears drunk, carries a flask, and behaves in ways that suggest chronic intoxication. This immediate establishment of alcohol as central to Rick's character is psychologically significant because it tells us that drinking is not separate from who Rick is. It is woven into his identity, his behavior patterns, and how he moves through the world. In the pilot episode, Rick bursts into Morty's bedroom in the middle of the night, clearly intoxicated, and drags Morty on a dangerous adventure to another dimension. He is slurring his words, making impulsive decisions, and showing the kind of disinhibited behavior that alcohol produces. This scene sets the template for hundreds of episodes that follow. Rick's adventures, his scientific achievements, his relationships with family members, and his philosophical monologues all happen while he is drinking or while he is under the influence of alcohol. The show does not present sobriety as Rick's default state with occasional drinking episodes. Instead, it presents constant drinking as the baseline from which everything else in his life proceeds. A psychologist observing this pattern would note that when alcohol use is this pervasive and this consistent, it moves beyond casual drinking or even heavy drinking into the territory of dependency. Dependency means that the substance has become integrated into the person's daily functioning to the point where they structure their life around it, and where stopping would create significant disruption. Rick's flask is as much a part of his character design as his lab coat or his blue hair. He carries it everywhere, drinks from it reflexively, and seems to have access to alcohol in every situation, regardless of where he is or what dimension he is visiting. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 shows Rick drinking throughout a series of increasingly chaotic adventures. When problems arise, Rick's response is not to slow down or reconsider his approach. His response is to continue drinking while dealing with whatever chaos emerges. A psychologist would observe that this pattern suggests Rick uses alcohol not just for pleasure or social purposes, but as a constant companion that helps him manage whatever situations he encounters. The drinking is not occasional or situational. It is continuous and automatic, like breathing or blinking, something Rick does without conscious thought or decision. The consistency of Rick's drinking across hundreds of episodes and across multiple seasons is itself psychologically revealing. Many television shows depict characters drinking heavily in certain episodes or certain situations, yet those same characters appear sober in other episodes when the plot does not require them to be drunk. With Rick, the drinking is always present. Whether he is at family dinner, in his garage laboratory, on an interdimensional adventure, at a party, in danger, or in moments of apparent calm, he is drinking. This consistency suggests that alcohol has become a fundamental part of how Rick functions, rather than something he does only in specific contexts. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches from Season 1 demonstrates how Rick's drinking continues even during catastrophic situations. When Rick and Morty accidentally turn everyone on Earth into monsters, Rick continues drinking while trying to fix the problem. When the attempted fix makes things worse, turning everyone into even more horrifying creatures, Rick keeps drinking. When they ultimately have to abandon their original dimension and move to a new one where versions of themselves have just died, Rick is drinking throughout the entire process. The alcohol does not stop even when facing existential crises or making decisions that will permanently alter their lives. A psychologist would note that this inability to pause drinking even during critical moments suggests a level of dependence where stopping is not really an option that Rick considers. The visual presentation of Rick's drinking is also remarkably consistent across episodes. He is nearly always shown with his flask, taking drinks at random moments, sometimes mid-sentence while talking to someone, sometimes while running from danger, sometimes while building complex technology. The animators make this drinking so frequent that it becomes background detail rather than a highlighted plot point. This visual consistency reinforces the narrative consistency. We do not need dialogue to tell us Rick is an alcoholic, because we see him drinking constantly in every episode. The show does not need to make a special announcement about his alcoholism because it is simply present in how Rick is drawn and animated in nearly every scene he appears in. A psychologist would also observe that the show treats Rick's drinking as normal within the world of the show. Other characters rarely comment on it, rarely try to intervene, and rarely suggest that Rick should stop drinking or seek help. This normalization within the show's reality reflects how alcoholism often functions in families and social systems. When someone has been drinking heavily for long enough, the people around them stop reacting to it. It becomes part of the background, accepted as just how that person is. The family has adapted to Rick's constant drinking, rather than confronting it or treating it as a problem that needs to be addressed. The episode Something Ricked This Way Comes from Season 1 shows Rick establishing a laboratory in the garage and conducting experiments while drinking throughout. His scientific work, which is presented as genuinely brilliant and successful, happens while he is intoxicated. He invents a device to remove curses from objects. He builds complex machinery. He solves problems that no one else can solve, all while drinking from his flask. This creates an interesting psychological dynamic. Rick's drinking does not prevent him from being functional in certain ways. He still invents incredible technology, solves complex problems, and successfully navigates dangerous situations. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern common in high-functioning alcoholism, where the person maintains certain capabilities and achievements while still engaging in chronic substance use that creates other problems in their life. The narrative structure of Rick and Morty often involves Rick proposing an adventure, bringing Morty along, and then dealing with whatever chaos emerges from that adventure. Throughout these adventures, Rick is drinking continuously. The drinking is not presented as impairing his ability to handle the immediate challenges of the adventure. He still fights monsters, escapes from danger, and uses his intelligence to solve problems in real time. Yet a psychologist would note that even if alcohol does not prevent immediate functioning during action sequences, it still affects judgment, decision-making, emotional processing, and relationships in ways that may not be immediately obvious during the excitement of an adventure. The episode Anatomy Park from Season 1 shows Rick shrinking Morty down and sending him inside a homeless man's body that Rick has turned into an amusement park. This bizarre and dangerous plan happens while Rick is drinking. Rick conceived this entire idea, executed it, built the technology to make it possible, and manages the situation as it unfolds, all while intoxicated. The fact that Rick came up with this plan and thought it was a good idea raises questions about how alcohol might be affecting his judgment about what is reasonable or ethical to do. A psychologist would consider whether a sober Rick would make the same choices, or whether alcohol contributes to his willingness to put Morty in danger for his own amusement or scientific curiosity. The consistency of Rick's drinking also means that we never get to see what sober Rick would be like for comparison. We do not have episodes where Rick decides to stop drinking for a week and we see how his behavior changes. We do not have flashbacks to a time before Rick was an alcoholic that show him functioning differently. The closest the show comes to this is occasional references to past events or alternate dimension versions of Rick. Yet even these versions are typically shown drinking. This absence of a sober comparison point is itself significant. It suggests that Rick's identity has become so merged with his alcoholism that imagining him without it would mean imagining a fundamentally different person. The episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind from Season 1 introduces the Council of Ricks, which is a governing body of Rick Sanchez versions from different dimensions. Nearly all of these Ricks are shown drinking or carrying flasks identical to our Rick's flask. This suggests that across infinite dimensions and infinite variations of Rick's life choices, the drinking remains constant. Some of these Ricks had different careers, made different choices, ended up in different circumstances, yet they all drink heavily. A psychologist would find this interesting because it implies that whatever drives Rick to drink is not just about circumstances or specific life events. It is something core to his psychology, something fundamental to who Rick is across different versions of his life, that manifests in chronic alcohol use regardless of external factors. The narrative constant of Rick's drinking establishes alcohol as the lens through which we must understand his character. Every action Rick takes, every relationship he has, every philosophical position he expresses, happens in the context of chronic alcohol use. When trying to understand Rick psychologically, we cannot separate his drinking from his other characteristics. They are integrated and interconnected. His intelligence, his nihilism, his cruelty, his occasional warmth, his relationship patterns, all exist alongside and in interaction with his alcoholism. They shape each other in ways that make it impossible to understand any one aspect of Rick without considering the others. A psychologist observing this narrative constant would want to understand several things. First, what function does the alcohol serve for Rick psychologically? Second, how does chronic intoxication affect his cognitive and emotional functioning on a day-to-day basis? Third, how does his drinking impact his relationships and his behavior toward the people in his life? Fourth, what does his apparent unwillingness to address or change his drinking reveal about his psychology and his internal state? These questions guide our examination in the sections that follow, as we explore the different dimensions of how alcoholism shapes Rick's life. The episode Raising Gazorpazorp from Season 1 shows Rick continuing his normal drinking patterns while helping Morty deal with an alien child that Morty accidentally created. Family responsibilities do not change Rick's drinking. Scientific work does not change it. Danger does not change it. Emotional situations do not change it. Nothing we see in the show changes Rick's fundamental pattern of constant alcohol consumption. This unchanging nature of the drinking is psychologically significant because it suggests that Rick either cannot stop, has no desire to stop, or both. The drinking has become so fundamental to his functioning that it persists regardless of external circumstances or situational demands. The episode Ricksy Business from Season 1 shows Rick throwing a massive party that spans multiple dimensions. During this party, Rick is drinking even more heavily than usual, which is remarkable given his already high baseline. The party creates chaos that nearly destroys the house and creates serious problems for the family. Yet throughout all of this, Rick's drinking continues, uninterrupted. A psychologist would observe that Rick's relationship with alcohol is so central that even when he is engaged in activities that most people would consider fun or enjoyable, he still needs alcohol to participate fully or to enhance the experience. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This constant presence of alcohol in Rick's life creates the foundation for understanding how he uses drinking as a tool for emotional management and psychological survival. Section 2. Drinking and Emotional Coping. While Rick's constant drinking is established as a narrative fact from the pilot episode, the show also provides glimpses into why Rick drinks and what psychological function the alcohol serves beyond physical dependency. A psychologist observing Rick would note that his drinking appears to intensify in response to emotional distress, interpersonal conflict, and moments when he faces uncomfortable truths about himself. This pattern suggests that Rick uses alcohol as a coping mechanism for emotional pain that he either cannot or will not address through healthier means. The drinking serves a specific psychological purpose beyond just maintaining a physical addiction. It helps Rick manage emotions that feel overwhelming or intolerable to him. The clearest example of this emotional coping function appears in the episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2. In this episode, Rick reconnects with Unity, a hive-mind entity that he had a romantic relationship with in the past. Unity is a collective consciousness capable of assimilating entire planets, controlling the minds and bodies of all inhabitants to create a unified civilization. When Rick and Unity spend time together, their relationship is shown to be genuinely meaningful to Rick, in ways that are rare for a character who usually maintains strict emotional distance from everyone around him. They share memories together, they enjoy each other's company, and Rick displays a level of emotional openness and vulnerability that we rarely see from him in other contexts with other people. The episode shows Rick and Unity spending time together on a planet Unity has assimilated. They party together with bodies Unity controls, they reminisce about past adventures they shared, they engage in activities that clearly matter to Rick. During these scenes, Rick seems genuinely happy in a way that stands out against his usual cynicism and emotional guardedness. He laughs, he engages, he appears to be experiencing genuine joy and connection. However, Unity ultimately decides to leave Rick because the relationship is unhealthy and destructive for both of them. Unity sends Rick a letter explaining this decision, noting that being with Rick brings out Unity's worst impulses and prevents Unity from being the best version of itself. Unity explains that the relationship is codependent and harmful, and that they need to separate for both of their well-being. This rejection is clearly devastating for Rick. The episode ends with one of the most psychologically revealing scenes in the entire series, showing us exactly how Rick responds when his emotional defenses are completely overwhelmed by pain he cannot manage or suppress through his usual methods. Rick is alone in his garage late at night, drinking heavily, consuming alcohol at a rate much greater than his usual constant drinking. He moves around the garage in a state of visible emotional distress, stumbling, his movements uncoordinated and aimless. The animation shows him looking lost and broken in ways we do not typically see from a character who projects such confidence and superiority most of the time. The scene shows Rick preparing to commit suicide by disintegrating himself with a laser device he has built. He lies down on the floor of his garage, positions the laser device directly above himself, and starts the countdown sequence that will fire the laser. As the laser charges up and prepares to fire, Rick continues drinking from his flask, taking long pulls of alcohol while waiting for the device to kill him. The laser begins firing, a bright beam of energy moving slowly downward toward Rick's head, where it will disintegrate him completely. At the last possible moment, just before the laser reaches him and would disintegrate his head, Rick passes out from the alcohol. His head slumps to the side, changing the angle of his body, which causes the laser to miss him and burn a hole in the garage floor next to his head instead of hitting him. He survives only because he drank himself unconscious at the critical moment before the laser could complete its deadly work. A psychologist would observe several psychologically significant things about this scene, and what it reveals about Rick's relationship with alcohol and emotions. First, Rick's immediate response to emotional pain and rejection is to drink more heavily than his already chronic baseline consumption. The escalation in drinking directly corresponds to the escalation in emotional distress he is experiencing. When his normal level of intoxication is not sufficient to numb the pain he is feeling from Unity's rejection, he increases his consumption dramatically in an attempt to achieve the emotional numbness he desperately needs to avoid feeling the full weight of his heartbreak. Second, his suicidal ideation emerges specifically in the context of heavy intoxication. Alcohol reduces inhibitions and impairs judgment around self-preservation, making actions that might seem unthinkable or impossible when sober feel possible or even necessary when drunk. Third, the fact that he drinks until he passes out rather than completing the suicide attempt suggests that alcohol serves a protective function, even while it creates other serious problems in his life. The drinking allows him to avoid fully experiencing the emotional pain that might otherwise overwhelm him completely and push him to follow through with suicide while still conscious and aware. This episode reveals that beneath Rick's carefully maintained facade of not caring about anything, beneath his repeated claims that nothing matters and that attachment is pointless and foolish, he experiences deep emotional pain that he does not know how to process or manage except through alcohol and avoidance. Unity's departure triggered something in Rick that his normal psychological defenses could not handle. Whatever feelings he had for Unity, whatever hope he might have had for genuine connection and relationship, whatever vulnerability he allowed himself to feel during their time together, all of it came crashing down when Unity left. His response was to escalate his drinking to the point of unconsciousness and to attempt to escape from existence entirely through suicide. He wanted to stop feeling the pain, and when alcohol alone was not sufficient to accomplish that goal, he tried to stop existing altogether. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as emotional avoidance through substance use, where the person uses alcohol to numb feelings that feel intolerable or unbearable, or to escape from emotional awareness that creates too much psychological distress. Rick cannot or will not sit with his feelings and process them in healthy ways. He cannot seek support from others who care about him or who might help him work through the pain. He cannot work through the emotional pain using adaptive coping strategies that might help him heal and recover over time. Instead, his immediate and automatic instinct when confronted with emotional pain is to drink more until the pain becomes manageable or until he becomes unconscious and does not have to feel anything at all. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows another moment of emotional crisis for Rick, where drinking plays a central role in how he manages his feelings. Rick attends the wedding of his close friend Bird Person to a woman named Tammy. The wedding is a joyful occasion celebrating love and commitment between two people Rick cares about. The ceremony appears to go well, and there is a reception afterward where guests are celebrating. However, during the wedding reception, Tammy reveals herself to be an undercover agent for the Galactic Federation, the authoritarian government that has been hunting Rick. She shoots and apparently kills Bird Person in front of everyone at the wedding, then calls in Federation forces to attempt to capture Rick and everyone else present at the ceremony. The celebration turns into a massacre and a disaster in seconds. Rick's presence at the wedding, his status as a wanted criminal, led directly to this catastrophic outcome that destroyed his friend's happiness and possibly ended his friend's life. Rick escapes with his family, and they go on the run from the Federation forces who are now hunting all of them. Eventually, after living on the run and seeing his family suffer because of his presence in their lives, Rick makes the decision to turn himself in to Federation authorities to protect his family and to allow them to return to their normal lives, without being hunted as fugitives. Before doing so, he is shown drinking heavily, consuming alcohol at a rate that exceeds even his usual heavy consumption. He shares a moment with his family where he tries to express care for them in his own awkward and emotionally stunted way. Throughout this emotionally difficult goodbye scene, he is visibly intoxicated. The alcohol appears to help him manage the emotional difficulty of saying goodbye to his family, of accepting responsibility for the danger his presence has created for them, and of choosing to sacrifice his freedom and possibly his life for their safety. A psychologist would note that Rick uses alcohol to dull the emotional impact of difficult choices and painful situations. He cannot say goodbye to his family while feeling the full weight of that separation or the full weight of his guilt about the danger he exposed them to through his presence in their lives. So he drinks to create distance between himself and his emotions, to make the unbearable slightly more bearable, to allow him to function through a situation that would otherwise overwhelm him emotionally and make it impossible for him to do what he believes needs to be done. Throughout the series, across multiple seasons, Rick's drinking consistently increases in situations that would normally evoke strong emotions in most people. When he faces loss, rejection, failure, or responsibility for harm he has caused to others, he drinks more. When he has to make difficult decisions or face consequences for his actions, he drinks. When he experiences something that touches him emotionally, even positive emotions like connection or affection, he drinks to manage those feelings. This pattern is exactly what psychologists observe in people who use substances to cope with emotions they find difficult to tolerate or process in healthier ways. Rather than developing healthy emotional regulation skills like talking about feelings with trusted others, seeking support from family or friends, processing emotions through reflection or therapy, or simply sitting with discomfort until it passes. Naturally on its own, Rick has learned to manage emotional distress by numbing himself with alcohol. The episode The Rickshank Rickdemption from Season 3 shows Rick in a Federation prison, separated from his family and from his normal life. He is in a highly controlled environment, where his access to technology, freedom of movement, and resources is severely limited by his captors. Yet even in this controlled prison environment, where authorities monitor him constantly and where access to most substances would be restricted, Rick manages to obtain and drink alcohol. We see him drinking in his prison cell during his time there, maintaining his primary coping mechanism even when almost everything else has been taken from him. A psychologist would observe that even when external circumstances change dramatically, dramatically. Even when Rick is imprisoned and has lost access to almost everything that defines his normal existence, his coping mechanism of using alcohol to manage stress and emotional discomfort remains constant and unchanged. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of using alcohol to manage emotional distress connect directly to Rick's broader philosophical worldview and to how his nihilistic beliefs might both drive and justify his drinking behavior. Section 3. Alcohol and Nihilism. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of Rick's character is the relationship between his chronic alcoholism and his philosophical worldview, specifically his nihilism. A psychologist observing Rick would note that his drinking and his belief system appear to reinforce each other in a cycle that makes both more entrenched and more difficult to address or change. Rick repeatedly expresses the belief that nothing matters, that existence is meaningless, that attachment and emotion are pointless exercises in self-delusion that only lead to suffering. These nihilistic beliefs could drive someone to drink as a way of coping with existential despair and the emotional emptiness that comes from believing life has no meaning. At the same time, chronic alcohol use can reinforce nihilistic thinking by impairing cognitive function, reducing motivation for change, and creating a state of detachment from life that makes meaningful engagement with existence difficult or impossible. The episode Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 provides an early glimpse into Rick's nihilistic worldview and how it relates to his behavior and his drinking. After Rick and Morty accidentally turn everyone on Earth into monsters through a love potion that mutates, and then make the situation even worse with attempted fixes that create more horrifying transformations, Rick's solution is to abandon their entire dimension and move to a new dimension where versions of themselves have just died from an unrelated accident. Rick shows Morty the dead bodies of their alternate selves in this new dimension, bodies that died in an explosion in this version of reality. He then tells Morty to help him bury the bodies so they can take their places and assume the lives of these dead versions of themselves. Throughout this entire process, Rick is drinking and treating the situation as mundane and unremarkable, just another problem that requires a technical solution. For Morty, this is a profoundly traumatic experience. He has to bury his own dead body to take the place of a version of himself who just died, and to live in a dimension where he does not really belong, and where everyone he knows is not actually the version of those people he grew up with. Yet for Rick, this is just another day. Just another problem solved through a technical solution that completely ignores the emotional and philosophical implications of what they are doing. A psychologist would observe that Rick's nihilistic worldview allows him to take actions that would be psychologically devastating for most people without apparent distress or concern. The drinking helps maintain this detachment by preventing him from fully processing the emotional weight of his choices and the implications of treating entire realities as disposable and interchangeable. The episode The Ricks Must Be Crazy from Season 2 explores Rick's view of the universe and his place in it through a story about nested universes. Rick has created a miniature universe inside his car battery to power his vehicle, essentially enslaving an entire universe of intelligent beings for his personal convenience. The beings inside that universe have created their own miniature universe to power their society, and so on in an infinite regression. When confronted with the ethical implications of essentially enslaving an entire universe full of thinking, feeling beings for his own convenience, Rick shows no concern or guilt whatsoever. He drinks throughout the episode while defending his actions and dismissing any moral objections as naive or irrelevant. His nihilistic belief that nothing matters extends to the suffering he causes others, and to any ethical considerations about his treatment of beings he has created. The alcohol helps him maintain this position by preventing emotional engagement with the consequences of his actions and the suffering of the beings he has enslaved. A psychologist would consider whether Rick's nihilism is a genuine philosophical position that he arrived at through careful reasoning and reflection on the nature of existence, or whether it is a defensive rationalization that protects him from having to care about things and people in ways that would create emotional vulnerability and potential for pain. The fact that his most explicitly nihilistic statements often appear during or after drinking suggests that alcohol may play a significant role in maintaining this worldview. When you are chronically intoxicated, it becomes easier to believe that nothing matters because you are not fully present in your own life or fully engaged with reality. The emotional numbness that alcohol creates can feel like philosophical detachment from meaningless existence rather than what it actually is, which is chemically induced emotional impairment. The episode Total Recall from Season 2, while primarily focused on a parasite that creates false memories, includes moments where Rick's drinking and nihilism intersect in revealing ways. When the family is trying to figure out which memories are real and which are created by the parasites that have infiltrated their home and their minds, Rick remains drunk and cynical throughout the entire crisis. His approach to solving the problem is purely technical and analytical, showing no concern for the emotional impact on the family of discovering that many of their cherished memories are fabrications. A psychologist would note that Rick's combination of intelligence, nihilism, and chronic intoxication creates a person who can solve complex problems while remaining emotionally disconnected from the people those problems affect and from the human meaning of the situations he navigates. The episode Get Swifty from Season 2 shows Earth facing destruction from giant alien heads that appear in the sky and demand that the planet produce music for them to judge. Rick's response is to write a silly song while drunk, and then perform it on stage while continuing to drink throughout the performance. When the situation becomes more complicated and Earth's survival is genuinely in question, Rick maintains his nihilistic stance that none of it really matters in the grand scheme of things, while simultaneously working hard to solve the problem and save the planet. A psychologist would observe this contradiction at the heart of Rick's philosophy. If nothing truly matters, why bother solving problems at all? Why work to save Earth or help anyone? The answer seems to be that Rick's nihilism is not actually complete or consistent. It is a defense mechanism that allows him to avoid caring too much or investing too deeply while still engaging with life in limited and carefully controlled ways that do not require full emotional investment. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 includes a moment where Rick explicitly connects his worldview to his choices in a way that reveals the contradiction between his stated beliefs and his actual values. When he turns himself into the Federation to protect his family from being hunted as fugitives, he tells them not to make a big deal about it, that his sacrifice does not mean anything and should not be interpreted as evidence of caring. Yet his actions directly contradict his words. He sacrifices his freedom and potentially his life for people he repeatedly claims not to care about. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern where Rick's stated nihilism and his actual behavior do not align at all. The drinking helps him maintain the gap between what he says he believes and what his actions reveal about what he actually values and cares about deep down. The episode The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 opens with Rick in prison, and we get insight into his psychological state through his memories and his internal monologue. Even in his own mind, even in his memories of his wife and his young daughter before they died or disappeared from his life, Rick is shown drinking heavily. The nihilism appears to extend backward into his past, suggesting it is not just a response to recent trauma. A psychologist would note that if Rick was drinking heavily even in the past when he presumably still had his wife and a young daughter to care for, then his alcoholism predates whatever events led to his current extreme level of detachment and cynicism. This suggests that the drinking may have contributed to the development of his nihilistic worldview rather than simply being a response to it, and that his substance use may have played a role in the loss of his family. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 explores what happens when Rick and Morty have their negative personality traits physically removed from them through a spa detox process that separates positive and negative aspects of personality into separate beings. The detoxified version of Rick is confident and successful in traditional ways, without the constant drinking that usually defines him. Meanwhile, the toxic version of Rick that was removed and exists as a separate entity is shown to be aggressive, destructive, irrational, and heavily dependent on alcohol to function. This episode suggests that Rick's drinking is fundamentally connected to his negative traits and his nihilistic worldview. When those aspects are removed from him, so is the compulsion to drink constantly. A psychologist would find this revealing about the deep relationship between Rick's substance use and his core psychology, suggesting they are intertwined rather than separate issues. The episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Rick's nihilistic attitude toward authority and social structures that most people respect. When the President of the United States asks Rick for help with various problems, Rick treats him with open contempt and disrespect while drinking throughout all of their interactions. His nihilistic belief that all authority is arbitrary and meaningless, that presidents and governments are just social constructs with no real significance, allows him to behave in ways that most people would never consider. The alcohol reinforces this belief by reducing his inhibitions and his ability to engage in the kind of social calculation and self-restraint that would normally prevent such openly disrespectful behavior toward powerful authority figures. The episode Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rickpeat from Season 4 explores mortality through a plot where Rick creates clones of himself that activate automatically when he dies, allowing his consciousness to continue in a new body. Rick dies repeatedly throughout the episode from various causes, and each new clone version continues drinking immediately upon activation, often taking a drink as one of the first actions in the new body. A psychologist would observe that even when facing his own mortality repeatedly, even when dying and being reborn over and over, Rick's response is not to reconsider his choices or his worldview. Instead, he continues drinking without pause and maintains his nihilistic stance that death is just another technical problem to solve, rather than a meaningful event that should provoke reflection or change. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4 is a meta-episode that plays with narrative structure and breaks the fourth wall in various ways. And even in this self-aware context where the show itself becomes part of the story, Rick is shown drinking while dismissing the importance of stories and narrative meaning. His nihilism extends even to narrative itself, to the very idea that stories matter or mean anything beyond their technical construction. A psychologist would note that this represents an extreme form of nihilism, where even the fundamental human need for meaning-making through story and narrative is rejected as pointless. The drinking throughout this episode suggests that maintaining this level of complete nihilistic detachment from all meaning requires constant chemical assistance to sustain. A psychologist would also consider how Rick's nihilism affects his drinking and vice versa in a self-reinforcing cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. If you genuinely believe that nothing matters, then there is no reason to stop drinking or to make any positive changes in your life. If you are constantly intoxicated and experiencing the world through an alcohol-induced fog, it becomes much harder to engage with life in ways that might challenge your belief that nothing matters, or provide experiences of genuine meaning. The two patterns support and reinforce each other, creating a stable psychological system that actively resists change or growth. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of nihilism, reinforced by alcohol, create the context for understanding how Rick's drinking affects his most important relationships, particularly with his family members. Section 4. Alcoholism and Family Dynamics. Rick's chronic alcoholism does not exist in a vacuum separate from the rest of his life. It affects every relationship he has, and nowhere is this impact more visible and more consequential than in his interactions with his family members. A psychologist observing Rick would note that his drinking shapes how he relates to Morty, Summer, Beth, and Jerry in ways that range from subtle influences to dramatic and obvious impacts. The alcohol influences his judgment about what situations he puts family members in, his ability to be emotionally present and responsive to their needs, his patterns of behavior during family interactions, and the overall dynamic of how the family functions around his addiction and adapts to accommodate it. Rick's relationship with his grandson Morty provides perhaps the clearest and most troubling example of how alcoholism affects family dynamics. From the pilot episode onward, Rick takes Morty on dangerous adventures while intoxicated, making decisions about what a 14-year-old boy should be exposed to while his judgment is impaired by alcohol. A psychologist would observe that Rick's drinking impairs his judgment about what is appropriate or safe for a child, leading him to involve Morty in situations that are physically dangerous, psychologically traumatizing, or both. In the pilot episode, Pilot, Rick drags Morty out of bed in the middle of the night while clearly drunk, and takes him to another dimension where they face armed security forces and nearly die. Morty experiences intense fear and confusion throughout this experience. Rick's decision-making while intoxicated puts Morty in danger repeatedly throughout the series, and the drinking prevents Rick from fully recognizing or caring about the inappropriateness of his choices regarding a child's safety. The episode Lawnmower Dog from Season 1 shows Rick taking Morty into the dreams of Morty's math teacher while drinking throughout the entire adventure. The plan is to convince the teacher to give Morty better grades by implanting ideas in his dreams through a device Rick has invented, similar to the concept in the movie Inception. However, the situation becomes dangerous when they encounter issues with layered dreams, and when other people's subconscious minds create threats they must fight. When Morty is traumatized by what he experiences in these nested dream worlds, and frightened by the dangerous situations they encounter, Rick's intoxicated state prevents him from providing appropriate emotional support or from recognizing the full psychological impact these experiences are having on his 14-year-old grandson. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking creates a situation where he involves Morty in adult situations and exposes him to psychological dangers while being too impaired himself to properly protect Morty or help him process the disturbing experiences afterward. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 demonstrates how Rick's drinking affects his relationship with Morty in terms of respect and consideration for Morty's autonomy and feelings. Rick is dismissive of Morty's ideas and inputs while intoxicated, treating Morty more as a prop or accessory for his adventures than as a person with valid thoughts and feelings that deserve consideration. When Morty insists on choosing an adventure himself to prove he can have good ideas too, Rick's drunk behavior during that adventure creates additional problems that Morty then has to deal with, undermining Morty's confidence and proving Rick's point in the worst possible way. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism prevents him from engaging with Morty as a full person, worthy of respect and genuine consideration, instead treating him as a sidekick whose role is to follow along with whatever Rick decides, without question or input. The episode Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 shows the catastrophic consequences that can result from Rick's impaired judgment while drinking. Rick helps Morty create a love potion to make his crush Jessica fall in love with him, and Rick does this while intoxicated without thinking through the potential consequences. When the potion goes horribly wrong and spreads through the entire population, turning everyone into mutated monsters, Rick's attempts to fix the problem while continuing to drink only make the situation worse, creating even more horrible mutations with each attempted solution. The episode ends with Rick forcing Morty to abandon their entire dimension and move to a new dimension where they bury alternate versions of themselves who just died in an unrelated explosion. They literally have to dig graves and bury their own corpses before assuming the lives of these dead alternate selves. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking contributed directly to the cascade of bad decisions that led to this profoundly traumatic outcome for Morty, and that Rick's intoxicated state prevented him from recognizing the profound psychological harm this experience would cause his grandson, who now has to live with the knowledge that he abandoned everyone he ever knew and is living a life that does not truly belong to him. Rick's relationship with his daughter Beth is also deeply affected by his alcoholism, in ways that have shaped her entire psychological development and current mental health. The episode Ricksty Minutes from Season 1 includes brief flashback scenes suggesting that Rick was drinking heavily even when Beth was a child, before he abandoned the family and disappeared from her life for many years. A psychologist would observe that Beth grew up with an alcoholic father who was emotionally unavailable even when physically present, and who then disappeared from her life entirely during her formative developmental years. This created deep attachment wounds and abandonment issues that persist into her adulthood and affect all of her relationships, including her marriage and her parenting. When Rick returns to Beth's life in the present day of the show, he is still drinking constantly at the same heavy level, which means Beth never gets the opportunity to have a relationship with a sober version of her father, or to experience what Rick might be like without the constant impairment of alcohol. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 explores the lasting psychological impact of Rick's parenting on Beth's development and current mental health in detail. The episode reveals that Rick created dangerous technology for Beth when she was a child, including a fantasy world called Fruipyland, where she could act out violent impulses. He enabled her worst impulses and darkest desires while he was presumably drinking and not supervising her properly, or considering the psychological impact of giving a child access to such power. As an adult, Beth has developed her own significant issues with alcohol use, anger management problems, violent tendencies, and unhealthy coping mechanisms that mirror Rick's patterns almost exactly. A psychologist would note that children of alcoholics very frequently develop their own substance use issues and maladaptive coping strategies, and Beth appears to fit this well-documented pattern perfectly. Rick's alcoholism during Beth's childhood and his emotional unavailability contributed directly to her psychological difficulties as an adult, creating an intergenerational cycle of dysfunction. The episode Bethic Twinstinct from Season 5 shows both Beth and her clone, Space Beth, displaying Rick's characteristic patterns of drinking heavily and using emotional avoidance as a primary coping strategy for dealing with difficult feelings. Both versions of Beth drink, both struggle with intimacy and vulnerability, both use aggression and detachment to avoid emotional pain. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism and the behaviors associated with it have been passed down generationally to his daughter, creating an intergenerational pattern of substance use and emotional dysfunction that will likely continue, affecting future generations unless actively addressed through intervention and treatment. Beth learned from Rick's modeling during her formative years that drinking is an appropriate and effective way to cope with difficult emotions, and that maintaining emotional distance is safer and more manageable than allowing genuine vulnerability with others. Rick's relationship with his son-in-law Jerry is characterized by open contempt and dismissiveness, much of which happens while Rick is drinking and therefore less inhibited about expressing his true feelings without social filters. The episode Something Ricked This Way Comes from Season 1 shows Rick treating Jerry with open hostility and mockery while intoxicated, making fun of Jerry's intelligence, his masculinity, his career, and essentially everything about him. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking lowers his inhibitions around social niceties and politeness, allowing him to express his contempt for Jerry without the normal social filters that most people would employ even when they dislike someone. The alcoholism makes Rick's treatment of Jerry more cruel and more damaging to family dynamics because he says things while drunk that he might have enough restraint to keep to himself while sober, or at least express in less hurtful ways. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2 includes scenes where Jerry tries to stand up to Rick about his negative treatment of the family and the problems his behavior creates for everyone. And Rick dismisses Jerry entirely, while drinking and not taking any of his concerns seriously. He mocks Jerry for even trying to have this conversation. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism prevents him from hearing or genuinely considering valid concerns from family members about how his behavior affects them and damages family functioning. Even when Jerry makes reasonable points about Rick's negative impact on the family's well-being and the way his presence disrupts their lives, Rick's intoxicated state allows him to dismiss these concerns without any genuine consideration. Self-reflection about whether Jerry might have valid points. Rick's relationship with his granddaughter Summer is also shaped significantly by his constant drinking, though this relationship receives less focus in the show than his relationship with Morty. The episode Raising Gazorpazorp from Season 1 shows Rick taking Summer on an adventure to an alien planet while drinking continuously, and his intoxicated state leads him to make inappropriate comments and to expose Summer to dangerous situations without adequate protection or preparation. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking affects his ability to maintain appropriate boundaries with his granddaughter, and to treat Summer in ways that are suitable for her age and appropriate to their grandfather-granddaughter relationship. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 shows how Rick's alcoholism affects the entire family system and all of the relationships within it in interconnected ways. When Rick takes Jerry on an adventure ostensibly to bond with him and repair their relationship, Rick is drinking throughout the entire experience, and his actual motive is simply to protect Jerry in order to make Beth happy rather than any genuine love, desire to connect with Jerry or improve their relationship. The entire adventure is shaped by Rick's drinking and his inability to have genuine emotional connections. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism prevents him from having genuine, sober interactions with any family members at all. Every single interaction is mediated through alcohol and the cognitive and emotional impairment it creates, which means the family never gets to know or relate to sober Rick, or to experience what he might be like without constant intoxication, affecting his mood, his judgment, and his capacity for connection. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Rick actively avoiding taking responsibility for potential offspring while drinking throughout, demonstrating how his alcoholism connects to his broader pattern of avoiding family responsibility and emotional commitment. When Rick might have fathered children with an alien in the past, his response is to drink and try to escape the situation rather than engaging with the possibility of parental responsibility or the needs these potential children might have. A psychologist would note that Rick's alcoholism is fundamentally connected to his avoidance of family responsibility and his inability to form healthy attachments with family members, whether his daughter, his grandchildren, or potential other offspring. A psychologist would also observe how the family as a system has adapted to Rick's alcoholism over time, in ways that enable it to continue rather than challenging it or creating pressure for change. Nobody in the family consistently confronts Rick about his drinking or insists that he needs to get help or make changes. Beth actively defends Rick's behavior, despite its obvious negative impact on everyone in the household. Morty continues going on dangerous adventures with drunk Rick, despite the repeated trauma and danger these experiences create. Summer adapts her expectations to accept Rick's limitations. Jerry complains sometimes, yet he also accommodates Rick's presence and behavior. The family has organized itself around Rick's alcoholism over time, accepting it as normal and unchangeable, rather than as a serious problem that needs to be addressed through intervention or treatment. This is a very common pattern in families with alcoholic members, where the family system gradually adapts to accommodate the addiction rather than challenging it or demanding change, creating what psychologists call an enabling environment, where the addiction can continue indefinitely without consequences. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick avoiding family dinner while drinking, suggesting that even mundane family interactions feel threatening or uncomfortable to him without alcohol as a buffer. When he does attend dinner, he is intoxicated, which prevents genuine connection with family members and maintains the emotional distance he seems to need. A psychologist would note that Rick's alcoholism ensures that all family interactions happen at a remove, mediated through chemical impairment that prevents real intimacy or vulnerability from developing in any of his family relationships. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The impact of Rick's drinking on family relationships connects directly to how his alcoholism affects his approach to risk and danger, particularly in the adventures he takes his family members on without regard for their safety. Section 5. Alcohol and risk-taking. A psychologist observing Rick would note that his chronic alcohol use is closely connected to his patterns of risk-taking behavior. Rick regularly engages in activities that would be considered extremely dangerous even for a sober person with full cognitive function, and he does these things while intoxicated, which compounds the risks significantly. The relationship between alcohol and risk-taking is well established in psychology. Alcohol impairs judgment, reduces ability to accurately assess danger, and lowers inhibitions that normally prevent people from taking actions that could harm themselves or others. For Rick, who already has tendencies toward reckless behavior and who operates with advanced technology that could destroy entire civilizations, the combination of alcoholism and risk-taking creates a particularly dangerous pattern. The episode Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender from Season 3 provides one of the clearest examples of how Rick's drinking leads to reckless and dangerous behavior, with serious consequences for others. In this episode, Rick joins a team of superheroes called the Vindicators to fight a cosmic villain named World Ender. However, Rick gets blackout drunk during the mission, meaning he drinks so much that he later has no memory of what he did while intoxicated. While in this blackout state, drunk Rick creates an elaborate trap for the Vindicators, filled with deadly challenges, essentially turning the mission into a sadistic game designed to humiliate and potentially kill his supposed teammates. When Rick wakes up the next day with no memory of creating these traps, he and the Vindicators must navigate the deadly challenges that drunk Rick set up. The traps are ingenious and complex, requiring the Vindicators to face moral dilemmas and physical dangers that result in several of them dying. A psychologist would observe multiple concerning things about this situation. First, Rick's drinking reached a level where he experienced complete memory blackout, which indicates extremely heavy alcohol consumption. Second, while in this blackout state, he had enough cognitive function to create elaborate technological traps, showing that his intelligence remains partially functional even when drunk enough to lose memory formation. Third, drunk Rick chose to use this intelligence to create situations that would harm and kill others, revealing that alcohol removes whatever limited moral restraints he might normally have. The episode shows that drunk Rick is even more dangerous than sober Rick because the alcohol removes his already limited concern for consequences and for the well-being of others. The traps he creates while blackout drunk show creativity and technical skill, yet they are directed entirely toward cruelty and destruction rather than any constructive purpose. When sober Rick realizes what drunk Rick did, he shows some level of concern about the consequences, yet not enough to prevent him from continuing to drink in future episodes. A psychologist would note that experiencing a blackout where you create deadly traps that kill people would normally be a significant wake-up call that leads to serious reconsideration of drinking behavior. Yet for Rick, it is just another adventure that gets resolved and then forgotten. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 shows Rick taking extreme risks to avoid attending family therapy. Rick transforms himself into a pickle to get out of going to therapy with his family, and while in pickle form, he ends up in a sewer where he must fight rats and other creatures to survive. He builds himself a mechanical exoskeleton using rat parts and other materials he finds in the sewer. Throughout this experience, Rick is unable to drink alcohol in his pickle form, which may contribute to his increased desperation and violence during this episode. The risks he takes in pickle form, fighting through a building full of armed guards while constructing increasingly complex mechanical enhancements, show his willingness to engage in potentially fatal activities rather than face the relatively low risk of attending a therapy session. A psychologist would observe that Rick's risk tolerance is so extreme that he would rather face actual mortal danger than the psychological risk of being vulnerable in therapy. When he finally makes it to the therapy session at the end of the episode, he immediately drinks from his flask, suggesting that he needs alcohol to tolerate even being in the room during an emotional conversation. The episode reveals that Rick's risk-taking is not just about seeking thrills or excitement. It is also about avoiding emotional risks that feel more threatening to him than physical danger. The episode The Old Man and the Seat from Season 4 shows Rick taking risks to protect something he values, specifically a private toilet he has hidden on a distant planet where he goes to have peaceful bathroom experiences. When someone else discovers and uses his toilet, Rick goes to extreme and violent lengths to find and punish the person who violated his private space. Throughout this quest, Rick is drinking and making increasingly risky decisions about how far he will go to defend his territory. The episode shows Rick crash landing on planets, getting into fights, and ultimately putting himself in danger over something that most people would consider trivial. A psychologist would note that Rick's intoxicated state makes him unable to accurately assess whether the risks he is taking are proportional to what he is trying to protect. A private toilet is not worth dying for. Yet drunk Rick cannot make that rational calculation. The alcohol impairs his judgment to the point where minor grievances feel like existential threats that justify extreme responses. This pattern appears throughout the series, where Rick's drinking leads to disproportionate responses to relatively minor problems. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4, while being a meta-narrative episode that plays with storytelling conventions, still shows Rick engaging in extremely risky behavior while drinking. The episode takes place largely on a story train where narratives come to life and Rick must fight through various dangerous scenarios while intoxicated. A psychologist would observe that even in a self-aware, metatextual episode, the show maintains the pattern of Rick taking extreme risks while drinking, suggesting this is a fundamental aspect of his character that persists across different narrative contexts. The episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Rick's risk-taking in relation to challenging authority. Rick gets into an escalating conflict with the President of the United States, and his drinking throughout this conflict leads him to take increasingly dangerous actions. actions. He breaks into the White House, fights Secret Service agents, and engages in behavior that would normally result in serious legal consequences. His intoxicated state makes him willing to risk his freedom and his life simply to prove a point and to refuse to show respect to authority figures. A psychologist would note that alcohol is often associated with increased aggression and decreased concern for consequences, which explains why Rick's conflicts escalate to physical violence rather than being resolved through negotiation. When drunk, Rick is unable to consider whether winning these conflicts is worth the risks involved. He operates on impulse and emotion rather than rational calculation, which is characteristic of alcohol-impaired decision-making. The episode Morty's Mind Blowers from Season 3, which is structured as a series of short memories that Morty asked Rick to erase, includes multiple scenes of Rick taking reckless actions while drinking. One memory shows Rick and Morty encountering an alien who can prove whether God exists, and Rick's drinking throughout this interaction leads him to make reckless statements and take unnecessary risks in pursuing this knowledge. Another memory shows Rick casually destroying an entire civilization while drunk, demonstrating the catastrophic consequences that can result from his impaired judgment combined with his access to powerful technology. A psychologist would observe that Rick's risk-taking while drunk extends beyond just personal safety, to include risks to entire civilizations and populations. When someone with Rick's level of intelligence and access to dangerous technology drinks to the point of severe impairment, the potential for catastrophic consequences increases dramatically. The episode shows that Rick has destroyed worlds and killed countless beings while intoxicated, yet this has not led him to reconsider his drinking or to implement any safeguards to prevent future disasters. The episode The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 shows Rick creating an elaborate and risky revenge scheme against Morty while drinking throughout. Rick builds a save point device that allows Morty to reset reality to a previous moment, then secretly manipulates the device to teach Morty a cruel lesson. The risks involved in creating technology that can manipulate reality are enormous. Yet drunk Rick does not hesitate to create such a device simply to prove a point to his grandson. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking allows him to engage in incredibly risky technological experimentation without adequately considering the potential consequences if something goes wrong. The episode Rattlestar Ricklactica from Season 4 shows Rick taking risks with snake civilizations and time travel while drinking. Rick and Morty accidentally kill a snake astronaut, which leads to snake time travelers coming after them. Rick's solution, implemented while drunk, is to give snakes time travel technology and to manipulate snake history, creating increasingly complex timelines and risking paradoxes that could destroy reality. The risks involved in manipulating time are presented as extreme, yet Rick's drinking prevents him from being deterred by these dangers. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcohol use makes him believe he can handle any consequences that arise from his risk-taking, creating a false sense of confidence that allows him to take actions that a sober person might recognize as too dangerous. Even when his risky behavior creates serious problems, he believes he can solve those problems through additional risky interventions, creating an escalating cycle where each attempted solution creates new dangers. The episode Promordius from Season 4 shows Rick taking risks with facehugger-like alien parasites while drinking. Rick and Morty get infected by aliens that take over their bodies and use them to create a civilization. When they eventually break free from the alien control, Rick's response while drinking is to manipulate the alien civilization in ways that create additional dangers rather than simply escaping. A psychologist would note that Rick cannot resist the impulse to interfere, and to assert his dominance even when doing so creates unnecessary risks. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick taking risks to avoid family dinner, including manipulating time in dangerous ways. Rick creates a situation where time moves differently in different locations, so he can have elaborate adventures with an alien ocean man while avoiding a simple family meal. The technological risks of creating time bubbles and the interpersonal risks of repeatedly lying to his family both stem from Rick's inability to tolerate the emotional discomfort of a normal family interaction. His drinking throughout these adventures suggests that alcohol helps him rationalize taking extreme risks to avoid minor discomforts. The episode Rickternal Friendship Sunshine of the Spotless Mort from Season 5 shows Rick taking extreme risks to save Bird Person by entering his mind and fighting his demons. While this shows Rick is willing to take risks for people he cares about, he does so while drinking and without considering whether his methods might cause more harm than good. His approach to saving Bird Person is aggressive and risky, potentially damaging Bird Person's mind in the process of trying to help him. A psychologist would observe that even Rick's attempts to help others are characterized by excessive risk-taking and insufficient consideration of potential negative consequences. The episode A Rick Convenient Mort from Season 5 shows Rick taking risks with planetary ecology while drinking. Rick and Morty visit a planet where Rick manipulates environmental systems, creating cascading consequences. Rick's intoxicated state prevents him from fully considering the long-term ecological impacts of his interventions, showing how alcohol impairs his ability to think through the full consequences of his actions beyond immediate results. A psychologist examining Rick's pattern of risk-taking while drinking would recognize several concerning elements. First, the alcohol removes whatever limited caution Rick might otherwise exercise, making him more likely to take actions without considering consequences. Second, Rick's high level of intelligence and technological capability means that his risk-taking can have consequences far beyond what would be possible for an ordinary person. Third, experiencing serious negative consequences from risk-taking while drunk has not led Rick to change his behavior, suggesting that he either cannot see the connection between his drinking and the problems it creates, or he does not care enough to make changes. Fourth, Rick sometimes seems to seek out risk deliberately while drinking, as if the danger provides excitement or helps him feel alive in ways that his normal existence does not. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of extreme risk-taking enabled by alcohol connect to the broader cognitive effects that chronic drinking has on Rick's mental functioning, judgment, and decision-making processes. Section 6. Cognitive effects of alcohol use. A psychologist observing Rick would note that chronic alcohol use affects cognitive functioning in multiple ways, and these effects are visible throughout the series in how Rick thinks, makes decisions, processes information, and interacts with the world around him. Alcohol impacts the brain both acutely, meaning the immediate effects while intoxicated during any given drinking session, and chronically, meaning the long-term changes that occur from sustained heavy drinking over months and years. Rick displays both types of cognitive effects throughout the series. His judgment is often impaired, his memory shows gaps and inconsistencies, his impulse control is limited, and his ability to consider long-term consequences is compromised by the constant presence of alcohol in his system. The episode Vindicators 3: The Return of World-Ender from Season 3 provides a clear example of how alcohol affects Rick's memory in dramatic ways. Rick experiences a complete blackout, drinking so much that he later has absolutely no memory of creating elaborate, deadly traps for the Vindicators team during the mission. Memory blackout occurs when alcohol interferes with the brain's ability to form new memories, meaning the person experiences events and takes actions during the blackout period, but those events are never properly stored in long-term memory. When Rick wakes up the next day and realizes what drunk Rick did while he was blacked out, he has to piece together his own actions from physical evidence and video recordings because he has no internal memory of those hours at all. A psychologist would note that experiencing blackouts indicates severe alcohol intoxication that is causing significant brain impairment during the drinking session. The fact that Rick can still function at a high level intellectually during these blackouts, creating complex technological traps and solving puzzles, shows that different brain systems are affected differently by alcohol at different stages of intoxication. The parts of his brain responsible for memory formation, specifically the hippocampus, are severely impaired during blackouts. Yet the parts responsible for problem-solving, technical creation, and motor coordination are still partially functional, enough to allow complex behavior. This creates a dangerous situation where Rick can do tremendously harmful things while intoxicated without later remembering doing them, which prevents him from learning from his mistakes or feeling appropriate guilt about his actions when he discovers what he did. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 explores what happens when Rick's negative traits, including his alcoholism and the cognitive patterns associated with it, are physically removed from him through a spa treatment that separates healthy and toxic personality aspects. The healthy, detoxified Rick shows improved cognitive function in several noticeable ways. He is more focused on tasks, makes better decisions about priorities, shows better social judgment, and achieves success in conventional ways that drunk Rick never manages to accomplish. This episode suggests that Rick's normal cognitive function is significantly impaired by his chronic drinking, and that without alcohol constantly in his system, he would be even more capable than he already appears to be. The toxic Rick, who was removed and exists as a separate entity, shows severe cognitive impairment in the opposite direction, acting impulsively, violently, irrationally, and showing almost no ability to plan or consider consequences. A psychologist would observe that this episode reveals how much of Rick's cognitive function is being suppressed or impaired by his chronic alcohol use on a daily basis. The detoxified Rick is successful, charming, socially skilled, and capable in ways that normal Rick is not, suggesting that alcohol is holding Rick back from reaching his full cognitive potential. However, the episode also suggests that Rick cannot sustain this improved state permanently, because his negative traits, including the psychological drives that lead him to drink, are fundamental to who he is psychologically and cannot be removed, without fundamentally changing his identity. The episode The Old Man and the Seat from Season 4 shows how alcohol impairs Rick's judgment about what is worth his time and energy and what constitutes a proportional response. Rick becomes obsessed with finding and punishing someone who used his private toilet on a remote planet, and his drinking throughout this quest prevents him from recognizing that his response is wildly disproportionate to the actual offense. A sober person might feel annoyed or violated about someone using their private space, yet would likely not devote days of effort and risk their life repeatedly to track down and punish the transgressor for such a minor violation. Rick's intoxicated state impairs his ability to assess whether his response is reasonable or appropriate, leading him to waste enormous time and resources on something objectively trivial. A psychologist would note that alcohol affects the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, planning, weighing options, and assessing consequences before taking action. When this area is impaired by alcohol, people make decisions based on immediate emotions and impulses rather than rational consideration of long-term outcomes or proportional responses. Rick's fixation on the toilet violation shows alcohol-impaired judgment, where he cannot step back and recognize that his emotional response is not justified by the actual significance of the event. His cognitive function is too compromised to engage in the kind of rational cost-benefit analysis that would help him recognize he is overreacting. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4, while being metatextual and experimental in narrative structure, still shows Rick's cognitive processes being affected by alcohol in observable ways. Rick navigates complex narrative structures and fights story-based enemies while drinking throughout the entire episode, and his solutions consistently tend toward violence and destruction rather than more creative, diplomatic, or less harmful approaches to the problems he encounters. A psychologist would observe that even in a situation that requires abstract thinking, creativity, and understanding of complex narrative rules, Rick's alcohol use pushes him toward aggressive, simplistic solutions rather than more nuanced approaches. That might work better. The episode Claw and Hoarder, Special Ricktum's Morty from Season 4, shows Rick's impaired decision-making and social cognition when Morty acquires a dragon. Rick's immediate response while drinking is to mock Morty's interest and to try to prove dragons are not real or worthwhile, rather than engaging with why Morty might want a dragon or what emotional need the dragon might fulfill for his grandson. When the situation with dragons becomes complicated and dangerous, Rick's solutions while intoxicated consistently involve violence, coercion, and domination rather than diplomacy, negotiation, or understanding. A psychologist would note that alcohol makes Rick less able to understand others' perspectives, less capable of empathy, and less able to respond to situations with emotional intelligence or nuance. His cognitive function while drinking cannot process social and emotional information in sophisticated ways. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Rick's cognitive impairment in relation to memory and the processing of emotionally significant information. When confronted with evidence that he might have fathered children with an alien in the past, Rick's drinking prevents him from engaging seriously with this possibility, or considering what responsibilities he might have toward potential offspring. His cognitive processes while intoxicated focus entirely on escape and avoidance, rather than on processing the information and making responsible decisions based on what he learns. A psychologist would observe that alcohol specifically impairs Rick's ability to engage with information that has emotional significance, or that would require him to acknowledge responsibility or vulnerability. His brain, while intoxicated, literally cannot process certain types of emotionally charged information in healthy ways, instead defaulting automatically to denial, avoidance, and rationalization. This creates a situation where important information about his life, his past actions, and his relationships never gets properly integrated into his understanding of himself and his obligations to others. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick's impaired judgment about time management, priorities, and basic efficiency in problem solving. Rick creates elaborate time manipulation schemes involving multiple timelines to avoid attending a simple family dinner while drinking throughout the process. He does not recognize that the time and energy spent creating and managing these time bubbles far exceeds what would have been required to simply attend dinner for an hour. His cognitive function while intoxicated cannot accurately assess which course of action is actually easier or more efficient, leading him to create unnecessarily complicated solutions to simple problems. A psychologist would note that alcohol significantly affects executive function, which includes the ability to plan ahead, prioritize among competing demands, and make efficient decisions about how to use limited time and resources. Rick's impaired executive function while drinking leads him to create overly complicated solutions that actually make his life harder rather than easier. Yet his intoxicated state prevents him from recognizing this self-defeating pattern, even when it repeats across multiple situations. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 shows Rick's impaired judgment in creating and using biological technology without adequate safety consideration. Rick creates giant sperm monsters while drinking, and his cognitive function is too impaired to adequately consider the dangers of creating such creatures or to implement appropriate safety measures and containment protocols before bringing them into existence. When the sperm monsters escape and threaten Earth, requiring a massive response to contain them, Rick's solutions, while continuing to drink, create additional problems and complications rather than cleanly resolving the initial crisis he created. A psychologist would observe that chronic alcohol use significantly affects risk assessment capabilities and the ability to plan for contingencies. Rick's brain, while intoxicated, cannot properly evaluate the potential consequences of his creations before he brings them into existence, and cannot adequately plan for what might go wrong or how to handle various failure modes. This creates a repeated pattern where his scientific work while drunk creates disasters that then require increasingly desperate and risky fixes. The episode Amortican Grickfitty from Season 5 shows Rick's impaired impulse control when he and Morty get involved with a space demon and dangerous alien technology. Rick's drinking throughout this episode leads him to make impulsive decisions about using dangerous technology and making deals with obviously dangerous entities without thinking through the implications or considering alternatives. His cognitive function is too impaired to engage in the kind of careful deliberation and cautious evaluation that would help him avoid obviously bad outcomes. A psychologist would note that impulse control is one of the cognitive functions most severely and consistently affected by alcohol use. The ability to pause between having an urge and acting on that urge, to consider consequences before taking action, requires brain functioning that alcohol specifically impairs. Rick's inability to resist impulses while drinking leads him repeatedly into situations that create serious problems for himself and others. The episode Gotron Geresis Rick Vangelion from Season 5 shows Rick's impaired cognitive flexibility when he becomes obsessed with collecting giant robot parts to complete a set. Rick's drinking throughout this quest prevents him from recognizing when he should abandon the project or when his methods are creating more problems than they solve. His cognitive rigidity while intoxicated means he cannot adapt his approach even when it becomes clear that continuing down the same path is counterproductive and causing harm. A psychologist would observe that cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift strategies when circumstances change or when you receive new information, is significantly impaired by chronic alcohol use. Rick gets stuck in rigid patterns of thinking and behavior while intoxicated, unable to step back and consider whether there might be better approaches to achieving his goals. This creates situations where he persists in failing strategies rather than adapting to new information or changing conditions. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 also shows how alcohol affects Rick's ability to work collaboratively with others toward shared goals. When the sperm monster crisis requires cooperation with other people and organizations, Rick's drinking makes him hostile, uncooperative, defensive, and unable to engage productively with others who are genuinely trying to help solve the problem he created. His cognitive function while intoxicated prevents him from recognizing when he needs help and from accepting that help graciously when it is offered. A psychologist would note that alcohol significantly affects social cognition, making it harder to accurately read social cues, to understand others' perspectives and motivations, and to engage in the kind of cooperative behavior that complex problem-solving often requires. Rick's impaired social cognition while drinking leads him to alienate potential allies and to try to solve problems completely alone, even when collaboration would be more effective and less risky. The episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshaw from Season 5 shows Rick's memory impairment more broadly, beyond just blackouts. Rick has created a device for selectively erasing memories, and his use of this device while drinking raises questions about how reliable his memory is at all, and whether he even knows what he has forgotten. A psychologist would observe that chronic heavy drinking causes memory problems even beyond acute blackouts, affecting the ability to form new memories reliably and to accurately recall past events without distortion. Rick's memory throughout the series shows inconsistencies and gaps that could be explained by alcohol-related cognitive impairment affecting memory formation and retrieval. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These cognitive effects of alcohol create the foundation for understanding how Rick uses drinking as a form of self-medication for deeper psychological pain and existential distress. Section 7. Alcohol as self-medication. A psychologist observing Rick would recognize that his chronic alcoholism functions as self-medication for deeper psychological pain and existential distress that he has never properly addressed or processed through healthier means. Self-medication refers to using substances to manage emotional pain, psychological symptoms, or mental health issues without professional treatment or therapeutic intervention. Rick appears to use alcohol specifically to escape from self-awareness, to avoid confronting painful truths about himself and his life, and to numb the emotional wounds that he carries from past trauma and loss. The drinking provides temporary relief from existential despair, guilt, shame, and the emotional consequences of his choices, yet it never actually heals the underlying wounds, and in fact, prevents him from ever addressing them in ways that might lead to genuine recovery. The episode The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 provides insight into the psychological wounds that Rick might be self-medicating with alcohol. The episode includes fabricated memories that Rick shows to his Galactic Federation interrogators, yet these memories may contain elements of emotional truth, even if the specific details are false. In these memories, we see Rick losing his wife and daughter to an explosion caused by another Rick. Whether this memory is literally true or not, the fact that Rick's mind constructed this narrative suggests that loss and grief are central to his psychological pain. A psychologist would observe that losing family members, particularly in violent or sudden ways, creates profound trauma that can lead to complicated grief, depression, and the use of substances to manage unbearable emotional pain. If Rick did experience significant loss of loved ones at some point in his past, his chronic drinking makes psychological sense as an attempt to avoid fully feeling that loss. Grief requires emotional processing, which means allowing yourself to experience the pain of loss, to remember what was lost, and to gradually integrate that loss into your understanding of your life. Rick's constant intoxication prevents this processing from happening. The alcohol keeps him at a distance from his grief, allowing him to function without ever having to fully experience the devastation of what he has lost. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2 shows most clearly how Rick uses alcohol to manage emotional pain that threatens to overwhelm him. After Unity leaves him, Rick escalates his drinking dramatically and attempts suicide, suggesting that the pain he is experiencing feels unbearable without chemical intervention. A psychologist would recognize this pattern in people who have never developed healthy emotional regulation skills and who rely entirely on substances to manage feelings that become too intense. Rick has not learned how to sit with emotional pain, to tolerate it, or to process it gradually over time. His only strategy is to numb it with alcohol or to try to escape it entirely through death. The episode also reveals that Rick experiences profound loneliness despite being surrounded by family and despite having the ability to travel to infinite dimensions. His relationship with Unity suggests that he craves connection and intimacy, yet he does not know how to maintain relationships in healthy ways. The loneliness that comes from being unable to connect authentically with others is a deep form of psychological pain that many people attempt to self-medicate with substances. Alcohol temporarily reduces the feelings of isolation and provides a chemical substitute for genuine human connection. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Rick self-medicating before making a sacrifice for his family. When he decides to turn himself in to protect them, he drinks heavily before saying goodbye, suggesting that he cannot tolerate the emotional intensity of the situation without alcohol. A psychologist would observe that Rick uses drinking to manage any situation that requires genuine emotional presence or vulnerability. The alcohol allows him to go through the motions of emotional moments without actually having to feel the full weight of those emotions, or to be truly present in the experience. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 explores Rick's guilt about being a bad father and about how his parenting affected Beth's psychological development. Throughout the episode, Rick drinks while confronting the reality of his failures as a parent and the lasting damage he caused to his daughter. A psychologist would recognize that guilt and shame are incredibly painful emotions that many people attempt to avoid through substance use. Rick's drinking allows him to acknowledge his failures on an intellectual level, while avoiding the full emotional impact of recognizing how much harm he caused to someone he loves. The episode also reveals that Rick gave Beth dangerous technology as a child, possibly leading to harm to other children. If Rick bears responsibility for enabling Beth to hurt or kill other children, the guilt and shame from this would be enormous and potentially unbearable without chemical numbing. Self-medicating with alcohol would make psychological sense as a way to live with knowledge about yourself that feels impossible to face directly. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 shows Rick going to extreme lengths to avoid therapy, which would require him to engage in self-awareness and to confront truths about himself. Rick literally transforms himself into a pickle to escape family therapy, suggesting that self-awareness feels more threatening to him than the physical dangers he faces while trying to get back to human form. A psychologist would observe that Rick's drinking serves a similar function to his pickle transformation. Both are ways of avoiding psychological work and self-examination. When Rick finally attends therapy at the end of the episode, he immediately drinks from his flask, showing that he needs alcohol to tolerate even being in the room during an emotionally honest conversation. The therapist in the episode suggests that Rick uses his intelligence to avoid genuine emotional processing, and the same could be said about his drinking. The alcohol is another tool Rick uses to maintain distance from authentic self-awareness and from confronting the reality of his life and his choices. The episode The Old Man and the Seat from Season 4 reveals that Rick has created a private toilet on a remote planet where he goes to find peace and solitude. This suggests that Rick experiences his normal life as so overwhelming or distressing that he needs to escape to another planet just to have moments of calm. A psychologist would observe that if someone needs to travel to another dimension just to experience peace, they are likely carrying enormous psychological distress that they are trying to manage or escape from on a daily basis. The alcohol serves a similar escape function, allowing Rick to create psychological distance from his distress without having to physically leave. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Rick avoiding confronting the possibility that he has children he abandoned or neglected. If Rick has fathered children and then left them without support, the guilt and shame from this would be significant sources of psychological pain. His drinking throughout the episode allows him to avoid engaging with this possibility emotionally, to dismiss it and move on without having to feel the weight of what it would mean if true. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick using elaborate time manipulation to avoid family dinner, revealing that even mundane family interactions create enough psychological discomfort that he will go to extreme lengths to escape them. A psychologist would observe that this level of avoidance suggests deeper issues with intimacy, vulnerability, and the emotional demands of relationships. The drinking helps Rick tolerate family interactions when he cannot avoid them, providing a buffer between himself and the genuine emotional presence that relationships require. The episode Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort from Season 5 shows Rick entering Birdperson's mind to help him recover from trauma, And in Bird Person's Mindscape, we see representations of Rick's role in Bird Person's suffering. Rick caused or contributed to significant harm to one of his closest friends. A psychologist would recognize that knowing you harmed people you care about creates profound psychological pain that requires either genuine processing and attempts at repair, or numbing and avoidance through substances. Rick appears to have chosen the latter path. The episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshall from Season 5 explores how Rick deals with painful memories by erasing them rather than processing them. Rick has created technology to remove memories he does not want to live with, suggesting that he has accumulated experiences and knowledge about himself that feel unbearable to remember. The fact that he erases memories while drinking suggests that even the process of deciding what to forget requires chemical assistance. A psychologist would observe that someone who needs to regularly erase their own memories is likely experiencing profound psychological distress from the accumulated weight of their life experiences. A psychologist would also consider what existential distress Rick might be self-medicating beyond just specific traumatic events. Rick has an extraordinary level of knowledge about the universe. He understands that there are infinite dimensions, infinite versions of himself, and that nothing any individual does has cosmic significance. This knowledge could create existential despair about the meaninglessness of existence. Many people struggle with existential questions about meaning and purpose, even without Rick's level of knowledge. For someone who truly understands the scope of infinity and the insignificance of any individual life within that infinity, the existential despair could be overwhelming. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3, when Rick's negative traits are removed, shows that without his toxicity, including his alcoholism, Rick can find conventional success and satisfaction. This suggests that Rick's drinking is part of a broader pattern of self-sabotage, where he prevents himself from experiencing genuine satisfaction or success. A psychologist would recognize that self-medication can serve this function, keeping someone in a state of perpetual dysfunction that prevents them from having to face the possibility of genuine happiness or fulfillment, which might feel threatening. For various psychological reasons, the episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Rick choosing conflict with the president over cooperation and partnership, suggesting that Rick actively sabotages potentially positive relationships and opportunities. His drinking throughout this conflict helps him maintain the antagonistic stance and prevents him from recognizing when he is creating unnecessary problems for himself. A psychologist would observe that self-medication can help people maintain maladaptive patterns by numbing the awareness that might otherwise lead to change. The episode Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rickpeat from Season 4 shows Rick dying repeatedly and immediately drinking upon being regenerated in a new clone body. This suggests that consciousness itself feels so uncomfortable for Rick that he needs alcohol immediately upon regaining awareness. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating profound psychological distress, where simply being alive and aware feels unbearable without chemical intervention. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4 shows Rick dismissing the importance of stories and meaning-making, yet his need to constantly drink suggests that he has not actually achieved the indifference he claims to have. If existence truly meant nothing to Rick, he would not need to self-medicate to tolerate it. The fact that he drinks constantly suggests he is in pain and trying to manage that pain, which contradicts his claims of complete nihilistic detachment. A psychologist would observe that the drinking reveals emotional truth that Rick's words attempt to deny. A psychologist would recognize several key aspects of Rick's self-medication pattern. First, he is medicating multiple types of psychological pain simultaneously, including trauma, loss, guilt, shame, loneliness, and existential despair. Second, the self-medication prevents him from ever addressing any of these sources of pain in healthier ways, creating a stable pattern where the pain persists and the drinking continues indefinitely. Third, Rick lacks insight into his own self-medication, appearing to believe he drinks simply because he wants to, rather than recognizing he drinks because he psychologically needs to in order to manage unbearable internal states. Fourth, the self-medication has become so chronic and severe that it now creates additional problems and additional sources of psychological pain, creating a cycle where drinking causes more pain, which leads to more drinking. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of self-medication through alcohol connect to Rick's profound denial about his drinking problem. problem, and his resistance to acknowledging or addressing his dependency. Section 8. Denial and Insight. A psychologist observing Rick would note that despite overwhelming evidence of severe alcoholism and its negative consequences, Rick rarely, if ever, acknowledges that his drinking is a problem or that he might need help. Or intervention. This denial is a hallmark feature of addiction, where the person cannot or will not recognize the severity of their substance use or the ways it is harming themselves and others. Rick's denial operates on multiple levels simultaneously. He denies that he drinks too much compared to what would be considered normal or healthy. He denies that the drinking causes problems in his life or in his relationships. He denies that he is dependent on alcohol or that stopping would be difficult. And he denies that he needs any kind of intervention, treatment, or support to address his drinking. This denial is maintained through various psychological defense mechanisms, including rationalization, minimization, deflection, and outright rejection of reality when confronted with evidence. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 provides the clearest example of Rick's denial and his active avoidance of anything resembling insight or self-examination. Rick transforms himself into a pickle specifically to avoid attending family therapy, demonstrating that he will go to extreme and absurd lengths to escape situations that might lead to self-awareness or accountability. The fact that he would rather become a pickle and fight through a sewer full of rats than sit in a therapy session for an hour reveals how threatening he finds the possibility of genuine self-examination. When the family therapist later confronts Rick directly about his patterns of avoidance, Rick responds with dismissal and mockery rather than engaging with her observations or considering whether they might be accurate. She tells him that he seems to have a pattern of using his intelligence to avoid genuine emotional processing and growth. And Rick's response is to leave the session immediately and to drink from his flask, which is exactly the avoidance pattern she was describing. A psychologist would observe that Rick's response to accurate psychological observations about his behavior is to reject them entirely without any consideration of their validity. He does not pause to wonder if the therapist might have valid points that could help him understand himself better. He does not consider whether her analysis might explain some of his struggles or some of the problems in his life and relationships. He simply dismisses her insights as irrelevant, mocks the entire process of therapy as pointless, and returns to drinking, which is exactly the avoidance pattern she was describing in her observations. This demonstrates profound denial, where Rick cannot tolerate even brief exposure to accurate observations about his psychological functioning without immediately defending against them. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2 shows Rick experiencing a crisis that would typically lead to recognition that something needs to change. Yet even this severe crisis does not break through his denial. After Rick attempts suicide following Unity's departure, he survives only because he drank himself unconscious at the critical moment before the laser could complete its deadly work. Most people who survive a suicide attempt experience this as a profound wake-up call that leads to seeking help, entering treatment, or making significant life changes to address the problems that led to the attempt. For Rick, this experience appears to have no lasting impact whatsoever. In subsequent episodes, he continues drinking at the same levels and shows no signs of having been affected by coming so close to ending his own life. A psychologist would observe that Rick's denial is so strong and so deeply entrenched that even nearly dying by his own hand does not create enough insight or motivation to inspire change. The fact that his family never learns about the suicide attempt also enables the denial to continue, unchallenged by external pressure or concern. If Beth, Morty, and Summer knew that Rick had attempted suicide while alone in his garage, they might intervene more forcefully or insist he get help. They might recognize the severity of his psychological distress and demand that he address it. By keeping the attempt private and never discussing it with anyone, Rick ensures that his denial can persist without external pressure to acknowledge the severity of his problems or the desperation of his psychological state. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Rick making a significant sacrifice for his family by turning himself in to the Federation to protect them from being hunted. Yet even this act of love and selflessness does not lead to any insight about his drinking or any desire to change his patterns. When Rick is in prison in the following episode, The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3, He continues drinking even in the controlled prison environment where access to substances would normally be restricted. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking is so automatic and so defended by denial that even imprisonment and forced separation from his family does not interrupt it or create any moment of reflection about whether his lifestyle and choices are serving him well. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 provides an interesting window into Rick's denial through the detox process that physically removes his negative traits. When Rick's toxic aspects are removed and exist as a separate entity, the healthy Rick who remains is successful and functional in conventional ways without drinking at all. He achieves professional success, forms healthy relationships, and demonstrates capabilities that his normal alcoholic self never shows. This demonstrates, objectively, that Rick's life would be better and more functional without his alcoholism and associated negative patterns. Yet, when Rick is later reunited with his toxic traits and returns to his normal state, he shows absolutely no interest in trying to recapture the success and functionality he had while detoxified. He does not reflect on the experience or consider what it revealed about how his drinking holds him back from achieving his potential. A psychologist would observe that Rick's denial extends to rejecting even direct personal evidence that his life could be significantly better if he addressed his problems. He experienced firsthand what life without his toxicity would be like, yet he chooses to return to his dysfunctional patterns without hesitation or apparent regret. This suggests that the denial serves important psychological functions beyond just protecting his ability to continue drinking, possibly protecting him from having to acknowledge how much of his suffering is self-inflicted rather than inevitable. The episode The Old Man in the Seat from Season 4 shows Rick creating an elaborate private space on a distant planet to escape from his life. Yet he never considers that his intense need to escape might indicate underlying problems worth addressing. He treats his need for escape as normal and justified, rather than as a potential symptom of deeper psychological issues that might benefit from attention. When someone violates his private space, Rick's response is rage and revenge, rather than any reflection on why he needs to travel to another planet and dimension just to experience moments of peace. A psychologist would observe that Rick's denial prevents him from seeing patterns in his own behavior that might provide valuable insight into his psychological state and his unmet needs. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Rick deflecting when confronted with evidence that he might have fathered and abandoned children with an alien partner. Rather than engaging with this possibility seriously or considering what it might mean about his patterns of avoiding responsibility and abandoning family, Rick drinks throughout the encounter and tries to escape the situation entirely. He makes jokes, changes the subject, and focuses on proving the children are not his, rather than confronting what it would mean if they were. A psychologist would note that deflection is a key component of denial, where the person changes the subject, makes jokes, or focuses on irrelevant details rather than engaging with uncomfortable truths about themselves and their choices. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick creating elaborate time manipulation schemes to avoid attending a simple family dinner, rather than simply acknowledging that family interactions make him uncomfortable and working to understand and address why that is. His denial extends to his own emotional experience, where he cannot or will not acknowledge basic truths about what he finds difficult and why those things create discomfort for him. A psychologist would observe that this level of denial about one's own internal experience makes any kind of psychological growth or change nearly impossible, because you cannot address problems you refuse to acknowledge exist in the first place. The episode Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort from Season 5 shows Rick entering Bird Person's mind to help him recover from trauma. Yet even while confronting visual representations of the harm Rick caused to his friend through his actions and choices, Rick shows no signs of genuine insight or remorse that leads to changed behavior. He saves Bird Person in this instance, yet this does not lead to any broader reflection on his patterns of harming people he cares about or any desire to change those destructive patterns. A psychologist would note that Rick can acknowledge specific instances of harm in isolated moments when forced to confront them directly. Yet his denial prevents these acknowledgments from connecting into a broader recognition of problematic patterns. across his life. The episode A Mordecai Grick Fitty from Season 5 shows Rick continuing to make impulsive decisions while drinking without ever pausing to consider whether his constant intoxication might be affecting his judgment and decision-making. His denial extends to the cognitive effects of alcohol, where he appears to believe he functions just as well drunk as he would sober, despite clear evidence throughout the series that his judgment and decision-making are significantly impaired by drinking. This denial about the effects of alcohol on his functioning allows him to continue drinking without having to acknowledge that it creates problems. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 shows Rick creating biological disasters while drinking. Yet, when these disasters create massive problems requiring enormous effort to resolve, Rick never considers whether his drinking might have contributed to the poor judgment that created the mess in the first place. His denial prevents him from connecting his substance use to the negative outcomes that result from decisions made while intoxicated. A psychologist would observe that this inability to see the connection between drinking and consequences is central to how denial perpetuates addiction, creating a cycle where the person never recognizes that their substance use is creating problems. A psychologist would also observe that nobody in Rick's life consistently challenges his denial or confronts him about his alcoholism in ways that might create sustained pressure for change or recognition. Beth defends Rick and makes excuses for his behavior to others. Morty complains occasionally about specific situations, but continues participating in Rick's adventures without demanding change. Summer accepts Rick's drinking as normal and does not question it. Jerry criticizes Rick generally, but does not specifically address the alcoholism as a problem that needs treatment. The family has collectively adapted to Rick's denial rather than challenging it consistently and forcefully, which allows the denial to persist unchallenged and unchecked. The episode Analyze Piss from Season 6 shows Rick actively resisting and undermining attempts at psychological analysis. When a character tries to psychologically profile or understand Rick, Rick responds with hostility and sabotage rather than cooperation or even neutral tolerance. A psychologist would recognize this as Rick protecting his denial from anything that might threaten it. Genuine psychological analysis, or therapy, would require Rick to develop insight into his patterns and problems, which would threaten the denial that allows him to continue drinking without feeling he needs to change. The episode Final Desmithation from Season 6 shows Rick continuing his established patterns without any signs of developing insight or desire for change, demonstrating that his denial has not weakened despite years of consequences and despite repeated experiences that might typically lead to recognition that change is needed. A psychologist would observe that Rick's denial is deeply entrenched and maintained by multiple psychological mechanisms operating simultaneously that would be very difficult to break through without intensive, sustained intervention that Rick would have to agree to participate in. A psychologist would recognize several key aspects of Rick's denial system. First, it is comprehensive, extending to all aspects of his drinking and its consequences rather than being selective. Second, it is maintained through multiple defense mechanisms operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other. Third, it is supported by his family's enabling behavior and lack of consistent confrontation about the problem. Fourth, it is protected by Rick's intelligence, which allows him to construct sophisticated rationalizations for his behavior that sound convincing. Fifth, it is reinforced by Rick's ability to function at a high level in certain domains despite his alcoholism, which he uses as evidence that his drinking is not a problem. The denial also serves important psychological functions for Rick beyond just protecting his ability to continue drinking without interference. It protects him from having to feel shame about his addiction and dependency. It protects him from having to acknowledge that he needs help from others. It protects him from having to admit vulnerability or weakness. And it protects him from having to do the difficult work of change and recovery, which would require sustained effort and discomfort. The denial allows Rick to maintain his self-image as someone who is in control and who does not need anyone, which appears to be central to his identity and sense of self. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This profound denial about his alcoholism connects to how Rick presents different versions of himself to the world versus who he is in private moments, creating a gap between his public persona and his internal experience. Section 9. Public versus private self. A psychologist observing Rick would note a significant gap between his public persona and his private self, and alcohol plays a central role in maintaining this gap, and in shaping how Rick presents himself to the world. Publicly, Rick projects charisma, confidence, humor, and complete control. He appears to be someone who has everything figured out, who fears nothing, who needs no one, and who operates at a level beyond ordinary human concerns. This public persona is carefully constructed and maintained, and alcohol is integral to how Rick sustains it. The drinking allows him to present confidence and swagger while simultaneously preventing genuine vulnerability or emotional exposure. Yet in private moments, when Rick is alone or when his defenses fail, we see glimpses of profound pain, loneliness, fear, and desperation that the public persona is designed to conceal. The episode The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 shows Rick presenting different versions of himself to different audiences. When Rick is being interrogated by the Galactic Federation, he projects confidence and superiority, even though he is imprisoned and outnumbered. He drinks throughout the interrogation and maintains his charismatic, mocking persona despite his circumstances. He makes jokes. He shows no fear. He acts as though he is in control, even when clearly he is not. This public performance serves important psychological functions. It prevents others from seeing his vulnerability, it maintains his identity as someone who cannot be broken, and it gives him a sense of power in a situation where he actually has very little. A psychologist would observe that Rick's public persona while drinking is designed to prevent intimacy and to keep others at a distance emotionally. By projecting complete confidence and superiority, he signals that he does not need help, does not need connection, and does not need vulnerability. The alcohol helps him maintain this projection by reducing his capacity for genuine emotional expression, and by providing him with the chemical courage to sustain the performance, even when it requires significant psychological effort. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 demonstrates the lengths Rick will go to maintain his public persona and avoid revealing vulnerability. When faced with family therapy, which would require him to be emotionally honest and vulnerable in front of his family, Rick chooses to transform himself into a pickle and fight his way through a sewer and a building full of armed guards rather than sit in a room and talk about his feelings. This extreme avoidance reveals how threatening vulnerability feels to Rick, and how important maintaining his tough, invulnerable public image is to his sense of identity. When Rick finally arrives at the therapy session at the end of the episode, he immediately drinks and maintains his dismissive, superior attitude, even when the therapist makes observations that are clearly accurate and insightful about his patterns. His public persona requires that he reject help, reject insight, and reject the possibility that anyone else might understand him or be able to offer him something valuable. The drinking helps him maintain this rejection without having to feel the discomfort of recognizing that the therapist might be right. The episode Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender from Season 3, shows the contrast between Rick's public performance and his private behavior. Publicly, Rick projects superiority over the Vindicators team, mocking them and treating them as inferior, despite the fact that they are accomplished heroes. He drinks throughout the mission and uses humor and sarcasm to maintain emotional distance from the team. However, when Rick gets blackout drunk and creates elaborate traps for the Vindicators, this reveals private feelings of resentment, anger, and the need to prove his superiority that he does not acknowledge consciously or publicly. A psychologist would observe that drunk Rick's behavior while blacked out reveals truths about his internal state that his public persona is designed to conceal. The traps he creates are cruel and designed to humiliate the Vindicators, suggesting that beneath his public dismissiveness is genuine hostility and insecurity about his value relative to others. The drinking allows these feelings to express themselves while Rick is unconscious, yet when he wakes up and has no memory of what he did, he returns to his public persona without having to confront what his behavior revealed about his true feelings. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2 provides the clearest contrast between Rick's public and private selves. Throughout most of the episode, Rick is with Unity and appears happy, engaged, and genuinely connected in ways we rarely see. He is still drinking, yet he is also allowing himself moments of real joy and connection. However, when Unity leaves him and Rick is alone in his garage, the public persona completely collapses. We see Rick in profound despair, drinking even more heavily than usual, and attempting suicide. This private moment reveals the depth of pain and loneliness that the public persona is designed to hide. A psychologist would observe that the contrast between Rick's behavior with Unity earlier in the episode and his behavior alone after Unity leaves shows how much psychological energy Rick expends on maintaining his public facade. When that facade drops and he is alone with his true feelings, the pain is so overwhelming that death feels preferable to experiencing it. The drinking throughout the episode served to make both the connection with Unity and the subsequent despair more tolerable. Yet when Unity left, the alcohol was not enough to manage the pain, and Rick needed unconsciousness or death to escape it. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Rick maintaining his public persona even while making a profound sacrifice. When Rick turns himself in to the Federation to protect his family, he does so while drinking and while maintaining his characteristic dismissiveness about the significance of his choice. He tells his family not to make a big deal about it, preserving his public image as someone who does not care, even while his actions reveal deep care and love. The drinking allows him to perform this contradiction, to act lovingly while denying the love, to sacrifice himself while claiming it means nothing. A psychologist would note that Rick's public persona requires him to deny his own emotions and motivations, even when his actions make those emotions obvious to observers. The drinking helps maintain this denial by preventing him from fully experiencing the emotions that would make the truth undeniable even to himself. He can turn himself in for his family while drinking, maintaining the emotional distance that allows him to claim he does not care. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 explores what happens when Rick's negative traits are removed and he can no longer maintain his characteristic public persona. The detoxified Rick is successful, socially skilled, and confident in conventional ways, without needing the defensive superiority and mockery that normally characterize his interactions. This suggests that Rick's normal public persona, which is always accompanied by drinking, is actually a defensive construction rather than his authentic self. The toxic Rick, who was removed, shows the raw aggression, fear, and need for control that the public persona is designed to conceal. A psychologist would observe that this episode reveals that Rick's public confidence and superiority while drinking is at least partially compensatory, covering insecurity and fear rather than reflecting genuine self-assurance. The drinking helps him maintain the performance of superiority, even when internally he feels inadequate or threatened. The episode The Rick-Turian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Rick's public persona in conflict with authority. When dealing with the president, Rick maintains his characteristic mockery and superiority while drinking throughout their interactions. He refuses to show respect or deference even to the most powerful person in the country, maintaining his public image as someone who answers to no one and who recognizes no legitimate authority over himself. However, this public stance creates real problems and real conflicts that Rick then has to manage, suggesting that maintaining the persona comes at significant cost. A psychologist would note that Rick's public persona while drinking often creates problems that a more flexible and genuine presentation of self would avoid. However, the drinking makes such flexibility impossible because it locks Rick into habitual patterns of interaction based on maintaining his superior, invulnerable image, rather than responding authentically to each situation. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4, while being metatextual and experimental, still shows Rick maintaining his public persona even in contexts where that persona serves no practical purpose. He is dismissive, sarcastic, and superior while drinking, even when navigating narrative structures where genuine engagement might serve him better. A psychologist would observe that Rick's public persona has become so habitual and so reinforced by constant drinking that it persists even in situations where it is counterproductive. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick maintaining his public persona of being too important and too busy for family obligations, yet simultaneously going to enormous lengths to maintain relationships that matter to him. He creates time manipulation schemes to avoid family dinner while also maintaining his relationship with the ocean creature he befriends. The drinking throughout allows him to maintain the public stance that he does not care about family, while his actions reveal that he cares enough to construct elaborate deceptions to avoid disappointing them. A psychologist would observe that Rick's public and private selves are not simply different presentations of the same person. They represent genuinely conflicting aspects of his psychology, with the public self denying needs and feelings that the private self experiences intensely. The drinking helps maintain this split by preventing integration of the two selves, keeping the vulnerable private self hidden while the defensive public self interacts with the world. The episode Rick-ternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort from Season 5 shows Rick maintaining his public persona, even while doing something genuinely caring and risky to save Bird Person. He drinks throughout the process and maintains his characteristic dismissiveness about the significance of his actions. He rescues his closest friend from psychological destruction, yet cannot allow himself or others to see this as evidence of genuine care and attachment. The public persona requires that all caring actions be performed with ironic detachment, as if they mean nothing. A psychologist would note that this pattern, where Rick performs caring actions while publicly denying that they indicate care, creates confusion for the people in his life and prevents genuine intimacy from developing, even in relationships where real affection exists. The drinking facilitates this pattern by allowing Rick to act on his genuine feelings while being too impaired to acknowledge or integrate those feelings into his conscious understanding of himself. The episode A Mordecai Grick Fitty from Season 5 shows Rick's public persona in the context of a quest for revenge, where he maintains his confident swagger while drinking, even though the situation is created by his own impulsive bad decision. He never publicly acknowledges that he made a mistake or that he is in over his head, maintaining the facade of complete control even when events clearly exceed his ability to manage them easily. A psychologist would observe that Rick's public persona while drinking prevents him from acknowledging mistakes or limitations, which means he cannot learn from errors or seek help when needed. The persona requires that he always appear in control and superior, even when admitting a mistake and asking for help would lead to better outcomes. The gap between Rick's public and private selves creates significant psychological costs. Maintaining a false persona requires constant psychological effort and prevents authentic connection with others. The drinking helps sustain the performance in the short term, yet it also prevents Rick from ever resolving the split between his public and private selves by integrating his vulnerability and his strength into a more authentic whole self that could relate to others with genuine intimacy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This pattern of using alcohol to maintain a public persona while hiding his private self directly affects how Rick relates to his grandchildren, Morty and Summer, particularly in how he involves them in dangerous adventures while remaining emotionally detached. Section 10. Alcohol and Morty/Summer bonds. A psychologist observing Rick would note that his chronic alcoholism profoundly affects his relationships with his grandchildren, Morty and Summer, shaping how he involves them in his life, the types of experiences he exposes them to, and the quality of emotional connection he is able to offer them. Rick's drinking influences every aspect of these relationships. It affects his judgment about what is appropriate to involve children in, his ability to protect them adequately during dangerous situations, his capacity to be emotionally present and responsive to their needs, and his willingness to take responsibility for how his choices affect their well-being and development. The relationships with Morty and Summer are characterized by a contradictory pattern, where Rick clearly cares about them and wants their company, yet his alcoholism prevents him from expressing that care in healthy ways, or from protecting them from harm that his own behavior creates. The relationship with Morty is the most developed and provides the clearest examples of how alcoholism affects Rick's bonds with his grandchildren. From the pilot episode onward, Rick involves Morty in dangerous adventures while intoxicated, making decisions about risk and safety while his judgment is impaired. The pilot episode, Pilot, shows Rick dragging Morty out of bed in the middle of the night while drunk to take him on an adventure to another dimension. Rick's judgment about whether this is appropriate for a 14-year-old boy is clearly compromised by alcohol. He does not consider Morty's need for sleep, his fear during the adventure, or the trauma of nearly dying. The drinking allows Rick to prioritize his own desires without adequate consideration for Morty's well-being. A psychologist would observe that this pattern, established in the pilot, continues throughout the series. Rick wants Morty's company and seems to genuinely enjoy having Morty with him on adventures. However, his alcoholism prevents him from involving Morty in ways that are safe, appropriate, or emotionally healthy for a child. The drinking impairs Rick's ability to assess risk accurately, to plan for Morty's safety, to consider the psychological impact of experiences on a developing adolescent, or to provide emotional support when Morty is frightened or upset. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 shows Rick's drinking affecting his ability to respond to Morty's needs and ideas. When Morty wants to choose an adventure to prove he can have good ideas, Rick's intoxicated state makes him dismissive and unable to genuinely support Morty's autonomy. Rick drinks throughout the adventure Morty chose, and his impaired state contributes to problems that make the adventure go badly, which then reinforces Morty's insecurity about his own capabilities. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking prevents him from being the supportive presence that might actually help Morty develop confidence and good judgment. The episode Rick Potion number 9 Inches from Season 1 provides a dramatic example of how Rick's alcoholism affects his bond with Morty. Rick helps Morty create a love potion while drunk, and when things go catastrophically wrong, Rick's solution, while continuing to drink, is to abandon their entire dimension. Rick forces Morty to bury alternate versions of themselves and to live in a dimension that is not truly theirs. This is a profoundly traumatic experience for Morty. He has to bury his own corpse and live knowing he abandoned everyone he ever knew. A psychologist would observe that Rick's drinking prevented him from recognizing how traumatic this experience would be for a 14-year-old, from considering alternative solutions that might be less psychologically damaging, or from providing adequate emotional support to help Morty process what happened. Rick treats the dimension hopping as a technical solution to a problem without considering the emotional reality of what he is asking Morty to do. The drinking allows this emotional blindness to persist. The episode A Rickle in Time from Season 2 shows a rare moment where Rick's actions reveal genuine care for Morty. Yet even this moment is complicated by Rick's drinking and his inability to acknowledge his feelings. Rick sacrifices himself to save Morty when they are caught in a time-split situation. This action clearly demonstrates that Rick values Morty's life over his own. However, after they both survive, Rick immediately returns to drinking and dismissing the significance of what happened. He cannot allow the moment of vulnerability and genuine care to stand without being covered over with alcohol and defensive humor. A psychologist would note that Rick's alcoholism prevents him from building on moments of genuine connection with Morty. When opportunities arise for their relationship to deepen through acknowledged mutual care, Rick's drinking and the defensive patterns it enables shut down that possibility. This creates a pattern where Morty experiences Rick's care through actions, yet Rick never verbally acknowledges or affirms that care, leaving Morty uncertain about whether Rick truly values him. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Rick making the ultimate sacrifice for his family, including Morty, by turning himself in. Yet even this profound act of love is performed while drinking and while maintaining Rick's characteristic denial about caring. Rick tells Morty and the family not to make a big deal about his sacrifice, preventing Morty from having the experience of receiving acknowledged love and protection from his grandfather. The drinking helps Rick maintain this denial even while performing the caring action. The episode, Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3, shows what happens when both Rick and Morty have their negative traits removed. The detoxified versions of both can actually have a healthy, supportive relationship, where Rick treats Morty with respect and Morty can relax around Rick. This demonstrates that Rick's alcoholism is part of what prevents a healthy relationship dynamic from developing. When the alcohol and associated toxicity are removed, a better relationship is possible. Yet when they return to their normal states, the opportunity for that healthier relationship disappears. A psychologist would observe that this episode reveals that Rick is capable of having a healthier relationship with Morty, yet his alcoholism and the psychological patterns associated with it prevent that healthier relationship from manifesting in their normal interaction. The drinking keeps Rick locked into patterns of behavior that damage his bond with Morty, even though he genuinely cares about his grandson. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 shows Rick taking Jerry on an adventure to protect him for Beth's sake, demonstrating that Rick's relationships with family members are interconnected. His drinking throughout this adventure affects not just his direct relationship with Jerry, yet also indirectly affects Morty by influencing the family dynamics Morty lives within. When Rick is drunk and been treating Jerry badly. This creates tension in the household that Morty must navigate. A psychologist would note that Rick's alcoholism affects Morty not just through direct interactions, yet also through its effects on the entire family system. When Rick's drinking creates conflict with Beth or Jerry, Morty experiences that conflict and is affected by the tension and instability it creates in his home environment. Rick's relationship with Summer receives less focus in the show, yet his alcoholism affects this relationship in similar ways. The episode Raising Gazorpazorp from Season 1 shows Rick taking Summer on an adventure while drinking, and his intoxicated state leads him to expose her to situations that are inappropriate and dangerous for a teenage girl. He makes comments and involves her in adult situations without adequate consideration for her age or her safety. A psychologist would observe that Rick's drinking impairs his ability to maintain appropriate boundaries with Summer and to consider what experiences are suitable for his granddaughter. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 includes Summer's subplot where she deals with body image issues in ways that become extreme. While Rick is not directly involved in this plot, a psychologist would note that Rick's alcoholism and his resulting inability to be an emotionally present and supportive grandfather creates a family environment where Summer's psychological needs are not being adequately met. If Rick were sober and emotionally available, he might be able to provide support or perspective that would help Summer navigate adolescent challenges more healthily. The episode Rick Mancing the Stone from Season 4 shows Rick, Morty, and Summer dealing with Beth and Jerry's divorce, and Rick's drinking throughout this period affects his ability to help his grandchildren process their parents' separation. Rick takes them on adventures that serve as distraction, rather than helping them emotionally process what is happening in their family. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism prevents him from being the supportive adult presence that Morty and Summer need during a difficult family transition. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Rick involving both Morty and Summer in a situation where he might have fathered alien children, and his drinking throughout prevents him from considering how confusing and uncomfortable this situation is for his grandchildren. He prioritizes his own avoidance of the situation over their emotional experience of it. A psychologist would note that Rick's drinking regularly leads him to prioritize his own psychological comfort over the emotional needs of Morty and Summer. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick manipulating time to avoid family dinner, which affects his relationship with both Morty and Summer. His inability to simply have dinner with his family while sober speaks to how deeply his alcoholism has compromised his capacity for normal family interactions. Morty and Summer are learning that normal family time with Rick is impossible, which affects their expectations and their developing understanding of what relationships should look like. A psychologist would observe that growing up with an alcoholic grandfather who is frequently present yet emotionally unavailable affects Morty and Summer's psychological development. They are learning patterns about relationships, about trust, about emotional availability, and about what to expect from people who claim to care about them. Rick's alcoholism teaches them that love can coexist with neglect, that care can coexist with putting them in danger, and that emotional connection is threatening and should be avoided. The episode A Mortikin Grick Fitty from Season 5 shows Rick and Morty in a situation created by Rick's impulsive decisions while drinking, and Morty has to help deal with consequences of Rick's poor judgment. This pattern, where Morty must manage fallout from Rick's alcohol-impaired decisions, appears throughout the series. A psychologist would note that this reverses the appropriate roles, where the adult should protect the child. Instead, Morty frequently has to protect Rick or clean up messes Rick created while drunk. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 shows Rick creating a biological disaster that affects the entire family, and his drinking throughout prevents him from taking full responsibility for the problem or from adequately protecting Morty and Summer from the consequences. A psychologist would observe that Rick's alcoholism creates situations where his grandchildren are repeatedly endangered by his poor judgment, yet Rick's drinking prevents him from learning from these experiences or changing his behavior to protect them better in future. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns of how alcoholism affects Rick's relationships with Morty and Summer connect to the long-term patterns and accumulated consequences that have built up over the course of the series across multiple seasons and years. Section 11. Long-term patterns and consequences. A psychologist observing Rick across the entire series would note that his alcoholism is not a phase, not a response to recent trauma, and not something that improves or worsens significantly over time. It is a persistent, unchanging aspect of his life that has remained constant across multiple seasons and years of storytelling. From the pilot episode in Season 1 through the most recent seasons, Rick drinks at approximately the same levels, with the same frequency, and with the same apparent dependence on alcohol to function. This consistency across years demonstrates that Rick's alcoholism is deeply entrenched and stable, not a temporary problem that might resolve on its own or that responds to life circumstances. The long-term nature of this pattern also means that consequences have been accumulating over time, building up in Rick's relationships, in his physical and mental health, and in the wake of destruction he has created while intoxicated. The pilot episode Pilot from Season 1 established Rick's drinking as central to his character from the very first scene. 6 seasons later, Rick is still drinking at the same constant levels. This consistency is psychologically significant because it demonstrates that years of consequences, years of problems created by drinking, and years of opportunities to change have not resulted in any modification of the behavior. A psychologist would observe that this level of consistency indicates either profound denial that prevents Rick from recognizing a need to change, or psychological dependence so severe that change feels impossible, even if recognized as necessary. Or both operating simultaneously to maintain the pattern. The episode Ricksy Business from Season 1 shows Rick throwing an interdimensional party that nearly destroys the house, and he is drinking throughout. The consequences of this party include damage to the house, conflict with the family, and various dangerous situations. Yet in later seasons, we see Rick creating similar chaos while drinking without having learned from previous consequences. The episode Rickmancing the Stone from Season 4, years later in the show's timeline, shows Rick still making similar impulsive decisions while drinking that create similar types of chaos and consequences. A psychologist would note that the absence of learning from repeated consequences is characteristic of severe addiction. When the same problematic patterns repeat across years without modification, it indicates that the person either cannot see the patterns, cannot connect the patterns to their substance use, or feels unable to change despite recognizing the problems. For Rick, the evidence suggests all 3 factors may be operating together to maintain his drinking, despite accumulating negative consequences. The relationship with Beth provides a clear example of long-term consequences accumulating over time. Early episodes revealed that Rick abandoned Beth when she was young, presumably while already drinking heavily. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 explores the lasting damage this abandonment caused to Beth's psychological development. Beth developed attachment issues, difficulty with intimacy, aggressive tendencies, and her own problematic relationship with alcohol. These consequences of Rick's alcoholism during Beth's childhood persist into her adulthood and affect her own parenting of Morty and Summer. A psychologist would observe that alcoholism often creates intergenerational patterns of dysfunction. Rick's drinking affected Beth's development, which then affects how Beth parents her own children, creating ripples of consequences that extend across generations. The long-term nature of these consequences means they cannot be easily undone, even if Rick were to stop drinking now. The damage to Beth's psychology happened during critical developmental periods and has shaped her fundamental personality structure. The relationship with Morty shows consequences accumulating across the seasons as well. In early episodes, Morty was relatively innocent and naive. Over the course of the series, as Rick has involved him in increasingly dangerous and traumatic adventures while intoxicated, Morty has become more jaded, more anxious, and more damaged psychologically. The episode Fear No Mort from Season 7 shows Morty dealing with accumulated trauma from his experiences with Rick, suggesting that the psychological consequences of being Rick's sidekick while Rick is constantly drunk have been building up over time. A psychologist would note that repeated exposure to trauma and danger during adolescence, which is a critical developmental period, can have lasting effects on personality development, emotional regulation, and mental health. Morty has been repeatedly traumatized by experiences with drunk Rick across multiple years, and these experiences are shaping who he becomes as a person. The long-term consequences of this pattern will likely persist into Morty's adulthood, even if the adventures stopped today. The pattern of Rick creating catastrophic problems while drunk and then having to fix those problems also shows long-term consistency without improvement. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches from season 1 shows Rick creating a worldwide disaster while drunk. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from season 5 shows Rick creating another worldwide disaster while drunk. Years separate these episodes, yet the pattern is identical. Rick's drinking leads to catastrophically poor judgment, which creates massive problems, which Rick then has to address while continuing to drink. A psychologist would observe that this repetitive pattern over years indicates that Rick has not developed any better judgment, any better risk assessment, or any better impulse control, despite repeated experiences of his drinking leading to disaster. The long-term consistency of this pattern suggests deeply ingrained habits and cognitive patterns that have become automatic and resistant to change. The relationship with the broader family system also shows long-term consequences. Over the course of the series, the family has adapted to accommodate Rick's alcoholism, rather than challenging it or setting boundaries around it. Beth defends Rick despite his obvious problems. Jerry has given up trying to set boundaries. Morty and Summer have learned to accept Rick's drinking as normal. This family enabling has become more entrenched over time rather than improving, suggesting that the long-term pattern is one of progressive accommodation to dysfunction rather than progressive improvement. A psychologist would note that family systems often become more dysfunctional over time when addiction is present, if the addiction is not addressed. The family develops patterns of interaction that maintain the status quo rather than promoting change. These patterns become deeply ingrained and feel normal to family members, even though an outside observer would recognize them as unhealthy. The Smith-Sanchez family has followed this typical trajectory over the seasons. Rick's physical health, while not a major focus of the show, likely shows long-term consequences of chronic heavy drinking as well. Chronic alcoholism causes cumulative damage to the liver, brain, heart, and other organ systems. While the show does not typically depict realistic health consequences, a psychologist would note that in reality, someone who has been drinking at Rick's levels for years would be experiencing significant physical deterioration, even if they had access to advanced medical technology. The pattern of Rick's relationships beyond family also shows long-term consequences. Rick has lost friends and romantic partners over the course of the series, with his drinking contributing to these losses. Unity left him specifically because the relationship was unhealthy and brought out both of their worst qualities. Bird Person was nearly killed at an event Rick attended, with Rick's criminal status and reckless lifestyle contributing to the danger. Rick has accumulated a long history of damaged and destroyed relationships, yet continues the drinking that contributes to relationship destruction. A psychologist would observe that this pattern, where relationships are repeatedly damaged or lost, yet behavior does not change to prevent future losses, indicates that the addiction has priority over relationships in Rick's psychological hierarchy. He continues drinking despite knowing it damages relationships, suggesting either that he values the drinking more than the relationships, or that he feels unable to stop drinking even to preserve relationships he values. The accumulation of enemies and people seeking revenge on Rick also represents long-term consequences of his behavior while drinking. Over the seasons, Rick has made countless enemies through actions taken while intoxicated. These enemies create ongoing danger for Rick and his family. The episode The Wedding Squanchers shows consequences catching up when the Federation attacks Bird Person's wedding to capture Rick. Later episodes show other consequences from Rick's past actions creating current problems. A psychologist would note that consequences of addiction often accumulate in ways that create compounding problems over time. Each action taken while drunk creates potential future consequences. When those consequences arrive years later, they can feel unconnected to the original behavior, making it harder for the person to recognize the connection between their substance use and the problems in their life. Rick's accumulation of enemies and debts represents consequences of years of behavior while intoxicated. The pattern of Rick creating technological solutions to problems while drunk, and those solutions creating new problems, also shows long-term accumulation of consequences. Rick's garage is full of abandoned inventions, failed experiments, and dangerous technology created while drinking. Over the years, this accumulation of dangerous technology in the garage has created an environment where family members are at risk simply from being in the house. The episode Total Recall shows parasites infiltrating the house, and other episodes show various dangers emerging from Rick's accumulated work. A psychologist would observe that hoarding behavior, including accumulating projects and possessions without organizing or completing them, can be associated with addiction. The chaos in Rick's garage reflects the chaos in his psychological state, and both have been accumulating over years without resolution or improvement. The pattern of Rick's nihilism and philosophical beliefs also shows long-term consistency without evolution. From early seasons through later seasons, Rick expresses the same nihilistic views about meaning and value. His drinking appears to reinforce these beliefs by preventing him from having experiences that might challenge them. Over years, the nihilism and the drinking have become mutually reinforcing, creating a stable pattern that resists change. A psychologist would note that philosophical beliefs and substance use can interact in complex ways over time. Beliefs can rationalize substance use, while substance use can prevent experiences that might modify beliefs. Over years, this interaction can create increasingly rigid patterns where beliefs and behaviors reinforce each other in ways that make change progressively more difficult. The most significant long-term consequence may be the accumulation of psychological damage to Rick himself. Years of using alcohol to avoid processing emotions means years of unprocessed trauma, grief, guilt, and shame accumulating in his psyche. The weight of these unprocessed experiences grows heavier over time, rather than lighter. Each new traumatic experience or loss adds to the existing burden without the previous experiences being resolved. This creates an ever-growing psychological weight that makes stopping drinking feel progressively more impossible, because the prospect of facing all that accumulated pain without chemical numbing feels unbearable. A psychologist would observe that this is a common trap in long-term addiction. The longer the addiction continues, the more unprocessed psychological material accumulates, which makes the prospect of sobriety more terrifying, which makes continued drinking feel more necessary, creating a cycle where time makes the problem worse rather than better. Rick has been in this cycle for years, possibly decades, and the accumulation of unprocessed psychological material is likely enormous. The consistency of Rick's drinking across seasons, despite changing circumstances, also demonstrates that the alcoholism is not responsive to external factors. Rick has been imprisoned, has been separated from his family, has nearly died, has lost loved ones, has faced countless crises, yet none of these experiences have interrupted his drinking or motivated change. This unresponsiveness to circumstances indicates that the drinking is internally driven rather than environmentally driven, suggesting deep psychological dependence. A psychologist would note that when substance use persists unchanged across dramatically varying life circumstances, it indicates that the substance use is serving essential psychological functions that do not change even when external situations change. Rick needs alcohol to manage his internal psychological state, regardless of what is happening externally, which is characteristic of severe psychological dependence. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These long-term patterns and accumulated consequences across years of storytelling lead to understanding what Rick's alcoholism reveals about him as a character and about the human experiences the show explores through his struggles. Section 12. What alcoholism reveals about Rick. After examining Rick's alcoholism across multiple dimensions, including its constancy, its emotional functions, its relationship to nihilism, its effects on family, its role in risk-taking, its cognitive impacts, its function as self-medication, the denial surrounding it, the gap between public and private self, and its long-term patterns, a psychologist would recognize that the alcoholism serves as a lens for understanding Rick's deeper psychology and the human experiences the show explores through his character. The drinking is not just a random character trait or a source of humor. It is a window into Rick's internal world, revealing truths about pain, fear, avoidance, and the human struggle to cope with existence that might otherwise remain hidden beneath his intelligence and his defenses. Rick's alcoholism reveals that beneath his genius and his godlike technological capabilities, he is profoundly wounded and in enormous psychological pain. The constant drinking serves to numb pain that he cannot or will not address through healthier means. A psychologist would observe that Rick's intelligence makes his suffering more sophisticated and his rationalizations more elaborate, yet it does not make him less vulnerable to the fundamental human experiences of loss, grief, loneliness, despair. His ability to understand the universe does not protect him from emotional pain, and in some ways may intensify that pain by removing comforting illusions that help most people cope with existential questions. The Alcoholism reveals that Rick uses avoidance as his primary coping strategy for dealing with anything emotionally difficult. Rather than processing grief, he drinks until he cannot feel it. Rather than confronting guilt, he drinks until he can dismiss it. Rather than sitting with loneliness, he drinks until he becomes numb to it. Rather than facing the reality of his relationships and his choices, he drinks until reality becomes blurred and deniable. A psychologist would observe that this pattern of avoidance through substance use prevents any genuine psychological healing or growth from occurring. Rick remains stuck in the same psychological place across years because the drinking ensures he never has to fully experience or work through the emotions and experiences that might otherwise lead to change. The Alcoholism reveals Rick's profound fear of vulnerability and emotional intimacy. He drinks before, during, and after any situation that might require genuine emotional openness or connection. The alcohol creates a buffer between Rick and authentic relating, allowing him to go through the motions of relationships while never being fully present or genuinely vulnerable. A psychologist would recognize that this fear of intimacy often stems from early experiences of loss or betrayal that taught the person that emotional closeness is dangerous and leads to pain. Rick learned somewhere that opening your heart means creating opportunities to be hurt, and he uses alcohol to ensure he never has to risk that hurt again. The Alcoholism reveals the contradiction at Rick's core between his stated nihilism and his actual values and attachments. If Rick truly believed nothing mattered, he would have no reason to drink, because there would be nothing painful to escape from. The fact that he drinks constantly reveals that things do matter to him, that he does experience pain, and that he cares enough about certain people and outcomes to suffer when things go wrong. The drinking is evidence against his nihilistic claims, even as it helps him maintain those claims by preventing him from fully experiencing the emotions that would reveal how much he actually cares. A psychologist would observe that Rick's philosophical nihilism functions as another form of avoidance working alongside the alcoholism. Both the drinking and the nihilism protect him from having to acknowledge how much things matter to him and how much pain that mattering creates. They work together to maintain a psychological equilibrium where Rick can function without having to fully experience either the pain of caring or the despair of truly believing nothing matters. The Alcoholism reveals Rick's relationship with control and his fear of helplessness. Rick drinks to maintain a sense of control over his emotional state and his psychological experience. He chooses when and how much to feel by choosing when and how much to drink. This illusion of control helps him manage fear of being overwhelmed by emotions or circumstances beyond his control. Yet the irony is that the alcoholism itself represents a loss of control, a dependency that controls Rick even as he uses it to feel in control of his emotions. A psychologist would recognize this paradox, where people use substances to feel in control, while the substance use becomes the thing controlling them. Rick has surrendered control to alcohol, even as he uses alcohol to avoid feeling helpless in other areas of his life. The drinking has become his master, even as he uses it to feel like the master of his emotional experience. The alcoholism reveals Rick's capacity for self-destruction and self-sabotage. Someone with Rick's intelligence and resources could theoretically create an ideal life for himself if he wanted to. Yet he consistently makes choices while drinking that destroy opportunities for happiness, damage relationships, and create suffering for himself and others. A psychologist would observe that this pattern of self-sabotage often reflects deep-seated beliefs about deserving suffering or about happiness being impossible or dangerous. Rick may believe at some level that he does not deserve to be happy, or that happiness is an illusion that will only lead to greater pain when it is lost. The alcoholism reveals the limits of intelligence and knowledge as solutions to human problems. Rick's extraordinary intelligence allows him to understand the universe and to create amazing technology, yet it does not allow him to solve the problem of his own suffering. His knowledge about infinite universes and the nature of reality does not provide peace or contentment. In fact, that knowledge may contribute to his suffering by making life feel meaningless. The drinking reveals that intelligence alone cannot address psychological pain, that knowing why you suffer does not automatically stop the suffering, and that genius does not protect against addiction or self-destruction. A psychologist would observe that Rick represents a case study in how intellectual brilliance can coexist with profound psychological dysfunction. His intelligence creates the illusion that he has everything figured out, yet his constant drinking reveals that he is as lost and as much in pain as anyone else, just with more sophisticated ways of avoiding confronting that pain. The alcoholism reveals Rick's isolation and his profound loneliness, despite being surrounded by people. He drinks alone in his garage, he drinks in crowds, he drinks with family. The drinking ensures he is never truly with anyone because the alcohol creates a barrier between him and genuine connection. A psychologist would recognize that loneliness is one of the most painful human experiences, and that people in pain often engage in behaviors that, paradoxically, increase their isolation, even though isolation intensifies the pain they are trying to escape. The alcoholism reveals how addiction can become a stable identity that feels safer than change, even when that identity is associated with suffering. Rick has been an alcoholic for so long that sobriety would mean becoming a different person, and that prospect may feel more threatening than continuing to suffer in familiar ways. The drinking is part of who Rick is, and changing that would require confronting questions about identity and self that feel overwhelming. A psychologist would observe that long-term addiction often becomes integrated into identity in ways that make change feel like psychological death. Giving up the addiction means giving up a familiar version of yourself and becoming someone unknown, which can feel more frightening than continuing to suffer in ways you understand and have survived before. The alcoholism reveals the tragedy of potential unrealized. Rick could potentially be an even greater scientist, a loving grandfather, a supportive father, a good friend, if not for his drinking and the psychological patterns associated with it. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation showed glimpses of what Rick could be without his toxicity. Yet that potential remains unrealized because the drinking and the associated psychological dysfunctions prevent Rick from becoming his best self. A psychologist would observe that addiction often represents a tragedy of wasted potential, where the person remains trapped in destructive patterns that prevent them from becoming who they might otherwise be. Every day Rick continues drinking is a day where his potential remains locked away behind chemical impairment and psychological avoidance. The alcoholism reveals how the show uses Rick's character to explore universal human struggles with pain, meaning, connection, and mortality through the specific lens of addiction. While most people are not genius scientists, most people do struggle with psychological pain, with questions about meaning and purpose, with fear of vulnerability, and with the temptation to avoid difficult emotions rather than processing them. Rick's alcoholism takes these universal struggles and presents them in an extreme, visible form that allows viewers to recognize aspects of their own struggles in his. A psychologist would observe that effective storytelling often uses specific, extreme examples to illuminate universal truths. Rick's alcoholism is specific and extreme, yet it reveals truths about avoidance, pain, fear, and the human need for connection that apply far beyond addiction to alcohol. Ultimately, Rick's alcoholism reveals that he is a deeply human character, despite his superhuman intelligence and abilities. He suffers, he fears, he longs for connection, he struggles with meaning, he makes mistakes, he hurts people he loves, and he engages in self-destructive patterns he cannot seem to escape. The drinking makes all of this visible in ways that purely intellectual struggles might not. It grounds his character in recognizable human experiences of suffering and coping, making him relatable despite being a genius who can travel between dimensions. The show does not present Rick's alcoholism as a problem with a solution, or as something that will be resolved through a character arc of recovery. Instead, it presents the alcoholism as a constant aspect of who Rick is, allowing the show to explore the experience of living with addiction and the various ways it affects a person's life and relationships. This approach treats alcoholism as worthy of serious examination, rather than as just a source of humor or as a problem to be solved and moved past. The persistence of Rick's drinking across seasons allows for ongoing exploration of how addiction functions psychologically and how it shapes a life over time. A psychologist would observe that this sustained focus on alcoholism as a permanent aspect of a character, rather than a problem to overcome, reflects a realistic understanding that severe addiction is often a chronic condition that people manage, rather than cure. Rick's alcoholism is part of his character in the same way that his intelligence is, and the show explores both as lasting features that shape how he experiences and interacts with the world. The examination of Rick's alcoholism across these many dimensions reveals a character using substances to manage unbearable psychological pain, while simultaneously creating more pain through the consequences of that substance use. It reveals a person who is brilliant yet deeply wounded, powerful yet profoundly afraid, capable of love, yet unable to express it in healthy ways, entrapped in patterns of self-destruction despite having the intelligence to understand what he is doing to himself and others. This complex portrait goes far beyond simple stereotypes of alcoholism to show the intricate ways that addiction interweaves with personality, relationships, beliefs, and choices to shape a life. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.